And now the microphone works. The first revelation of the event. So, again, welcome you all. Encourage everyone, as I have. Thank you for coming to the table. We aim to make this an enlightening age conversation. I am John Tutino, and it is my privilege and pleasure to oversee the Americas Forum here and to bring events with what I will say amazing people. I'm going to introduce each of them in order before they present. But I will say in general, this is a group from whom in different ways I have learned more from as a group than I can account for. So I'm just really pleased for this event, and we will come in to the table, please. So the format is simply we've asked each of our guests to make approximately a 40-minute presentation on the issues in which they are, in each case, unequal analyst scholars of. We'll have 15 or 20 minutes of conversation in the event. There will be a break, so if you want to run for more coffee and or cookie and or water or juice, it's available. And then at the end of the time, we will be happily, if modestly disrupted, a reception with wine and more will arrive to keep conversations going. And as you can see, we are set up to do book sales and signing. That process we're aiming to have go coterminous with the reception. That way we deny our visiting authors a chance to enjoy themselves too much, but to promote. And I'm going to say, I'm just going to say, sad that we can't add Penny book to this. But the wonderful, dare I say, U.S. multinational press who published it in Spanish in Mexico has made it all but him to get and sell here. And I'll leave it, but recommend the work to you. We're operating in order, and we're going to start with Ben Smith, currently professor of history at Warwick University and whose work I knew as just contributing to both the social, cultural, and political history of Mexico. I will simply say that I couldn't have come to the understanding that shaped my work on the Mexican heartland without his work on the neighboring communities just over the mountains to the south. Every time I thought I understand what I had seen, I'd go consult Ben and say, okay, it was different over there. Now I got to explain how it's different there and where I'm looking at. And if I can figure something like that out, I'm close to understanding. And so that, and then he goes out and publishes the book and just moved his impact on Mexican history and understanding of Mexico to a completely other level. And because in the dope, he has really brought us a long term, a century essentially, of the history of, I'm not asking you to do it here today, but he has brought us the long term and the big picture. Basically, he taught me how not new, but radically changed all of it. So I'm going to first offer the floor, and I think the screen, to Ben Smith. And we'll open the conversations there forward. So thank you.
Yeah, just turning it on would help. Okay. The second thing I want to tell you is a bit about how I wrote it. Writing the history of the drug trade is fairly difficult, as I found out. And the third thing is some of the kind of major finds that I made. So I'm going to try and rush through this. I know that John has very generously given us 40 minutes. I'm sure that you'll be glad to know that I'm going to try and do this in 30, 35. So we have some time for questions afterwards. Okay. So first off, why did I do this? Well, I came to Mexico in late 1990s, early 2000s, and Mexico was, as many of you know, a place of great hope, right? It was a period of democratization when Vicente Fox, although being a quite disappointing pan president, at least in the early times, was quite a kind of hopeful political place with these extraordinary social movements, most notably the Zapatistas that were mixing kind of old school Marxism with new style identity politics. It was also an extraordinary kind of cultural moment where Mexico was putting itself culturally on the map. This was the time when the three great directors of Mexico, Alfonso Cuarón, Alejandro Inarritu, and other chap who did Pan's Labyrinth, Guillermo del Toro, were doing these great films. Sam was even in Mexico at the time, writing wonderful journalism. I mean, it was a real kind of cultural high point. However, so having come to Mexico in 2000, 10 years later, the Mexico that I had fallen in love with had radically changed. And I apologize, there might be some somewhat triggering images through this. Mexico that I saw in 2010 was one riven by violence, where places like Ciudad Juarez had a similar murder count to Baghdad or Kabul, where the countryside that I had basically walked merrily and ignorantly through in 2004, 2005 is now awash with poppy plantations, and where President Felipe Calderón had taken on himself a kind of military persona and had sent over 45,000 soldiers into the heartland of Mexico to try and wage war against these cartels. So I wanted to know why Mexico had changed so radically over this very thin 10-year period, right? So part of it was a kind of intellectual operation. And here you can see just some kind of figures which show you a little bit about how it changed. This is homicide rate in Mexico, which I'm sure everyone kind of has seen before, but to a certain extent, the yellow line is the American homicide. You can see around 2000, the difference in the Mexican and the American murder rate is not that great, right? We measure murder rates in how many murders per 100,000 citizens. Mexico has a murder rate of less than 10. America has a murder rate of kind of 6 or so. So they're not too different. However, by the end of the 2010s, Mexico has a murder rate up near 30 per 100,000. While America still has a murder rate of around 5 to 6, right? So Mexican violence had got much worse. If you look at these tables that come out every year on the most violent cities in the world, the places with the highest homicide rates, pretty much always they are dominated by Mexican cities. You can see this is the list from 2020, and you can see that the top 6 are all from Mexico and 7 of the top 10 are from Mexico. Mexico then had turned into a very violent place over the 10, 20 years I was researching it. However, there was also, I suppose, a slightly more personal story why I wrote this, and I want to kind of bring kind of 3 things to the fore. The first was, as I said, well, as John was mentioning, when I started my career, I spent a long time kind of researching the religion and the landscape of a place called the Mixteca Baja, which was where my wife came from. And I used to kind of wander up into the hills, kind of finding little religious pilgrimage sites and the like. And by the time I returned in 2013, it was simply impossible to do that. The hills that I had previously walked over were full of amapola, were full of opium poppies, even in a relatively removed place like Oaxaca. The second thing that I think really struck me is, like every good Brit, when I started off my career in Mexico, I found my pub, which is a place called La Farola in southern Mexico City. Fortuitously, it had a long history of inviting kind of down-at-heel Brits there. It was the place that Malcolm Lowry used to drink, Graham Greene, more embarrassingly, Evelyn Waugh. So this place in 2013, they very sadly, a group called the Zetas, a group of criminals, arrived in Oaxaca and basically approached every bar owner, every brothel owner, and every drug seller in the middle of Mexico City, put a gun to their head and said, if you don't pay us, then we're going to kill you. And they killed the owner of the bar, Oliver Torres, who owned La Farola, and it's never reopened since. So I suppose at that point, I realized that the violence that was being meted out in Mexico was not simply affecting people connected to the drug trade. This was connecting to people who were just kind of involved in very kind of small business. Basically. These were being targeted as well. The final thing that I suppose pushed me to write this book was in 2015, 2016, an increasing number of lawyers were approaching me from the United States going, we don't know what's going on. Mexico, there are loads of Mexicans arriving in the US asking asylum, escaping criminal violence. So from really that period on, I've worked with lawyers in the US, working on behalf of people basically fleeing criminal violence, fleeing cartel violence, who've come to the United States to try and find some kind of safety. So that's kind of, I suppose, the personal reason why I wrote this book. Second thing I like to say is, how did I write this book? I won't go too into depth. This is a bit kind of, I don't know, nerdy history. I don't want to go too into it. But in general, up to really, up to the time I wrote this book, the vast majority of historians argued that it was impossible to write the history of drugs in Mexico because we could never really penetrate the links between the drug traffickers and the state. All those links of corruption, right, were very difficult to penetrate because you didn't get politicians confessing that they'd met Chapo Guzman and Chapo had handed over $100,000 or $1 million, right? So it's impossible to glean those connections. So what historians instead tried to do, and I suppose most successfully by a guy called Isaac Campos, was instead look at the rhetoric, right? The culture around the drug war. And he found some really fascinating stuff, right? He found that, for example, a lot of the rhetoric about cannabis causing violence, right, which the US takes up in the 1930s, was actually invented in Mexico in the early 1900s, in the 1910s, right? But I confess, I thought that there were ways and archives which would open up some of the corruption right at the heart of the Mexican drug trade. So on the one hand, I used what every good historian of Mexico uses. So I used the kind of big general archives in Washington, D.C., but also in Mexico City. But I also made some kind of, I suppose, some kind of new finds. I wanted to just mention one in particular. In 1976, for example, a guy called Dan Boles, who was an Arizona journalist, was investigating the mafia's links to both Republican politicians in Arizona, but also with Mexican cartel members. He turned on the ignition in his Datsun and his car blew up. He died a couple of days later. After that, 40 journalists from Arizona and the surrounding states turned up in Arizona and did a year-long investigation into corruption, both at the level of the Arizonan government, but also at the level of the Mexican government, looking at their links to both the mafia and to the organized crime in Mexico and the putative cartels. Pretty much all of their investigations got spiked. They never were allowed to publish this in American newspapers. So their archive ended up, weirdly, in some kind of strange archive in Missouri, of all places. So I managed to track this down and managed to find boxes and boxes of journalistic investigations into the links, mapping out very clearly the links between organized crime and politicians on both sides of the border, which was really kind of extraordinary find. I'm very grateful for that. Beyond that, a couple of things I wanted to say. First off, newspapers were really, really helpful. I think we tend to see newspapers in Mexico as being particularly craven, right? Being basically paid off by organized crime or the politicians. And there is no doubt that many newspapers were, but they're also incredibly brave Mexican journalists historically for the last century who've investigated the links between organized crime and politicians, right? And they've been doing this and they've been killed for this since at least the 1920s. The final thing that I found extremely useful is I was very fortuitous to get access to private collections, partially of old DEA agents and old Mexican policemen who were extremely, well, certainly after a few drinks, they were relatively generous with that. I'm not sure how ethical any of this is. Very bad. So people like Hector Berreyes, you can see here, we can go into him. That's mad. But also, I was also lucky enough to get into the kind of private archives of certain kind of really, I suppose, retired or elder traffickers. So I was lucky enough to get, for example, the family album of a guy called Lalo Fernandez, who was really the first ever kind of cartel kingpin, starting out in the 1940s. He invented black tar heroin, and I managed to have he was so secretive, the DEA could never get a photograph of him, and I managed to get his family photo album. So I was very lucky with certain kind of private archives that I managed to kind of track down. The final thing I should say is like how to write drugs. When I first approached this project, I thought, like many academics, I'd write this big thing with like Cambridge University Press and have masses of footnotes. And then I realized the story that I wanted to tell was kind of, to a certain extent, it would have not been served terribly well by a purely academic book. So I spent a lot of my time before writing the thing, sitting down with Dashiell Hammett and James Ellroy and trying to, it sounds quite pretentious, write a kind of noir history, one that kind of mixed a kind of quick up-tempo prose with a certain amount of historical and political analysis. So that was my kind of aim. You're all very welcome to take a look at the book and say, okay, so that's how we do drugs. I now want to get into what my findings were. Okay, so the first and very basic finding, and frankly, the first two findings are not terribly novel or anything, was that American demand has always shaped the nature of the Mexican drug trade, right? Without the behemoth of US addiction to the north, Mexico, frankly, would have a minimal drug trade, right? It has no great, never, until the last 20 years, it's had virtually no problem with drug use or drug addiction. It's had a problem with alcoholism, no doubt, right? But it's always been US demand that has shaped Mexican production, right? So for example, in the 1940s, the US gets cut off from its European and Asian suppliers of opiates. Who steps into the breach? The Mexicans, right? 1960s, there's a massive upswing in the use of marijuana. Who produces that before Jamaica and Colombia start doing so? The Mexicans. And what I suppose what I thought was so fascinating was quite how responsive and quick the drug trade was in Mexico to changes in US demand. And I'll give you one example. In 1972, something called the French Connection is broken by a mixture of the French and the US governments. They basically stop heroin coming from factories in Marseille into New York and into the veins of American users. Within 4 months, Mexico is mass producing heroin and stepping into the breach. Now that's extraordinarily quick because it takes basically 4 months for the opium plants to grow, right? So almost back as soon as they closed the heroin factories in Marseille, the Mexicans were up and running sowing poppies in the fields of northwestern Mexico, and also importing French Connection chemists to make the heroin that North American addicts were using at the time, right? So highly responsive kind of market structure there. The second thing I wanted to bring out was, why has it been so difficult to suppress the Mexican drug trade? Why have they never been able to get hold of this? And I'll be talking a bit more about contemporary issues. But I think two things really struck me. The first was America has not had simply an appetite, is not just a large country with a normal appetite for narcotics. It is a large country with an extraordinary appetite for narcotics. So, for example, this is a graph here of cocaine use during the 1970s and through to the 1990s. By the 1990s, America was using 70% of the world's cocaine, right? 95% of that was traveling through Mexico, okay? Another example, the graph to the right, I'm sorry, I haven't got a title, is basically, have you smoked marijuana in the last month, right? In 1969, so even after the COVID period, that was only 4%. By 2013, it was 38%. So there's been this vast market for American drugs that the Mexicans have always been preying, okay? And it's been very difficult to get out of that. Now, having said that, the Mexicans have attempted to find their own solutions to this. And I wanted to give you an example of this. In 1940 or 1938, a particularly charismatic doctor becomes head of Mexico's basically health department. His name is Leopoldo Salazar Viniega. And he has two solutions to Mexico's drug problem. The first is, let's legalize marijuana. right? He says, in actual fact, it only causes a little redness in the eyes, a dryness of the palate, and a bit of hunger. It doesn't really cause all these kind of this kind of violent behavior. That's massively overstated. He writes this kind of extraordinary, ahead of its time, kind of 40-page medical inquiry into what marijuana does. However, he fails to bring through this legalization. Basically, the demonization of marijuana is so heavy in Mexico that he fails to get this legislation, this legalization through. The Americans, as you can imagine, are absolutely delighted he doesn't get this through. Because in 1937, they just banned marijuana. So they're very chuffed about that. But then he does something that really irritates them. He tries to, and successfully does, legalize morphine and heroin. And the logic behind it, I thought, was really fascinating and spoke to very much kind of the socialist era of Mexico that he was living through. His argument was that basically, if you have an illegal heroin or morphine market, the prices of heroin or morphine are very high. As a result, in order to pay for your morphine or your heroin hit, you've got to go and basically steal stuff. That basically high-priced drugs cause crime. So his example was, okay, what if we basically give away morphine and heroin to addicts for free, right? Then they can do a normal job. They don't need to buy very expensive drugs. Plus, we can give drugs that are safe, that aren't mixed with anything. Plus, we can put all the drug traffickers out of business because they no longer. Why would you buy your heroin off a street dealer when you can get your pure, good quality heroin delivered by a doctor safely in a Mexican hospital? So they basically set up a load of distribution points for morphine and heroin throughout Mexico City. And it's frankly a massive success. Okay, we're in the seat of American power. Any idea which country then closed down this ordinary thing? I can say that safe, but it's the Americans. Harry Anslinger, who is basically kind of like Hoover, but without the dress. He is head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he basically is also in charge of dishing out how much morphine every country can get from US supplies. And he says to the Mexicans, well, I don't like what you're doing with that morphine. You're giving it to drug addicts. I'm going to stop morphine being exported. So he stops morphine being exported. Mexican patients die in pain in Mexican hospitals because there's no morphine. And the Mexicans have to back down from that experiment. So it ends. So that's one reason why that experiment has not been successful. Okay, the next thing. So the first two, I think, findings are perhaps not terribly, maybe not terribly surprising. The third thing, however, I would like to kind of stress. This is what I'd like dine out on. My one idea that I've had as an academic. So it is basically that most people, when they talk about the link between drug traffickers and the state, they talk about corruption, right? However, what's happening in Mexico is not quite the traditional version of corruption. Traditionally, corruption is taking public money, your and my taxes, and using it for private purposes, right? Now, there is no doubt loads of Mexicans have done that, just like loads of British people have done that over the Tory government. So, for example, famously, this guy here, Arturo El Negro Durazo, used public funds in order to build a scale model of the Parthenon in the big city of Zihuatanejo. You can still go and visit it if you want, by brand. Also, for a scale model of Studio 54. Okay. However, the relationship between the state and the drug traffickers wasn't quite this, right? Because drug trafficking money isn't public money, it's private money. It's a drug trafficker's money. So what were they doing here? Effectively, what I worked out is that the state was running what I call protection rackets. It was approaching a drug trafficker and saying, I won't put you in prison if you give me 30%, 20% of your profits, right? So this was much more like, I'm going to protect you from persecution if you pay me money, okay? And the other thing I suppose I noticed about this is at least some of that money went not just into the pockets of the politicians, but also to building the state. I think I could glean most evidence about this figure here. His name is Esteban Cantu. He was governor of Baja California during the 1910s. And he basically, quite explicitly, first of all, he just legalizes opium and says, hold on, can you just pay me a bit of tax for this opium. Then, as you can imagine, the Americans get quite annoyed about that. So he basically approaches them and go, okay, I can't put this on the books, but you're still paying me tax and I'll still let you pick the opium den. And with that money, he builds roads, he builds schools, he puts police on the street, he puts soldiers basically stopping banditry in the countryside. He builds the state. However, my argument is that this continues almost up to the present day. And this is an extraordinary quote from a former head of the PJF, the Mexican Federal Police, in a PBS interview that he did in 2000, 3 years before he was shot in a Texas parking lot. So I'm not sure this was a quite revealing interview that might well have got him killed. And he answered as follows. So the PBS asked him, why are so many Mexican police commanders corrupt? What did you do to turn them into real police officers? Did you give them a budget? Did you give them gas for trucks? Did you give them better weapons, trucks, vehicles, intelligence, information, technology than the traffickers had? If you didn't give them any of this, really, what did you give them? You sent them off to become what they became, to take money from drug traffickers in order to fight them. Maybe they take the money from some of the traffickers to fight the other traffickers. What he's basically saying there is we're taking the money that you call corruption, we're actually using to fight the drug war, to build the state, right? To put troops and police on the streets. So this was, I suppose, one thing I found. The other thing, I suppose, instead of just calling this corruption and calling this protection rackets, it explains why the relationship between the state and the drug traffickers was also so violent, right? If it's simply about corruption, you just approach a drug dealer and you say, give me 10%, 20% of your profits, and the drug dealer hands it over. A protection racket is slightly different. You've got to force, right, the drug trafficker to hand over this money, because otherwise he might just say, I'm not doing it, right? So often you've got these emissaries of the state, these police officials who would torture, beat, and threaten drug traffickers to get a percentage of those profits. So a lot of the violence actually surrounding the drug trade, particularly up to the kind of 1980s, was actually state officials, policemen, army officers, forcing drug traffickers at gunpoint to hand over a section of their profits, right? So that's I think, the concept of the state-run protection rackets was kind of pretty important for the book. The other thing that I kind of brought up, and I won't go too much into this, was the US authorities on the other side of the border were just as involved in similar types of protection rackets, right? There was, and although, and this is a quote from a guy called Roberto Hernandez, who was a drug trafficker based in Tijuana in the 1970s. He said, the American police know perfectly well the movements of the traffickers on the frontier. Yes, they work with them, they exploit them. Now, most traffickers claim that American border police are corrupt or whatever. This guy named names, right? And as a result, the Americans were deeply annoyed about this. So he basically claimed the 4 heads of the San Isidro Customs Office were all on the tape from heroin and marijuana traffickers in the United States. So a distinct amount of corruption went on the US side as well, right? That this was not something simply from on the Mexican side. I suppose my fourth finding, which is perhaps the most, to me, in some ways, the most shocking, was quite how violent counter-narcotics campaigns were, not simply in the last 10 years, where we've seen they've been very, very violent, right, or 20 years, but back into the 1970s. So in the 1970s, the US and the Mexican authorities basically launched a war on drugs, somewhat similar to Felipe Calderon in 2006. They sent planes and helicopters into the mountains of Mexico and sprayed marijuana and opium plantations with DDT. They sent troops up there that arrested, tortured, and killed a load of peasants. They also, at the bidding of American DEA agents, assassinated Mexican drug traffickers, often in cold blood. And this particularly graphic, and I apologize for this rather triggering sight, but this is the only known photo of a guy called Pedro Aviles Perez, who was really the kind of king trafficker in the 1970s. And the Americans asked quite explicitly, we want him taken down. In actual fact, they put a $10,001 bounty on his head. and the Mexicans shot him dead together with 16 people accompanying him, including 6 teenage girls. So extrajudicial assassination was part and parcel of early counter-narcotics policies. The reason I have this is because the Americans didn't believe that the Mexicans had killed him. They paid somebody in the morgue in Sinaloa to take a picture of him dead on a mortuary flat. So that's why I have the photo of this. So yeah, pretty kind of gruesome stuff. Finally, and I just kind of wanted to end on this, the question of why did the Mexican drug trade become so violent? So one thing I found that was quite surprising, I suppose, is that from 1910 up to the 1970s, the Mexican drug trade was not violent, right? The vast majority of people who were involved in it were linked by compadrazgo, by friendship, by being neighbors, by family, by marriage, right? So this is, I told you I had the family album of Lalo Fernandez. This is him getting married to a member of the Caro Quintero family, right? Because these families were together. There was no point in doing over because you were often married, right? The only violence really in those early years of the drug trade was when the state tried to take over a protection racket, where it tried to shake down a reluctant drug trafficker for basically money. So the example I have here is a guy called Enrique Fernandez. He ran the Mexican drug trade in Juarez during the 1930s. He didn't want to pay the governor, a guy called Quevedo, as much as Quevedo wanted. So Quevedo, first off, sent in the police who killed 25 of Enrique Fernandez's men and dumped them outside Ciudad Juarez, basically in mass graves. Enrique Fernandez, who was quite a kind of dashing fellow, then dressed up as a Mexican worker, fled to, took a picture of himself, quite weirdly, which he then sent into the newspapers, fled to Mexico City, where he was tracked by gunmen of Quevedo and shot in the street. And this is a picture of him on the slab in the Red Cross Hospital, where he eventually died. So that was really the only violence, when the state intervened over protection money. So what happened? What changed? Well, first off, in the 1990s, there was what I would call the cartelization of Mexico. What do I mean by that? Effectively, up to the 1980s, it is the state that runs the protection rackets. They charge people that basically take drugs through regions of Mexico, right? You take your cocaine through Tijuana, you've got to pay the head of the federal police in Tijuana, right? During the 1990s, basically, the drug traffickers are bolstered by so much money coming in from cocaine that they basically form their own private armies and they take over the protection racket. It's now the Mexican traffickers that are running the protection racket. They are charging the independent transporters to transport drugs through their zones. And this is when you get the kind of upsurge in drug-related violence. I mean, I think everyone knows that if you're au fait with Latin American history, you'll know about the killing of Cardinal Posadas in 1993 by the Arellano Felix brothers. But I think perhaps one of the most unreported, but also most obvious examples of the way that kind of violence had changed was in 1998 in a suburban part of Ensenada on the Baja California coast. There were a group of weed dealers called the Salazar family. The Arellano Felix brothers there found out they weren't paying tax to them. So they sent in gunmen who not only killed Salazar himself, but also 17 members of his family, including 6 kids, right? It's, as far as I can notice, it's the first time that you get traffickers infringing the no women, no children rule, which has to a certain extent existed at least pre that, okay? So you suddenly get this kind of increase in violence during the 1990s. Over the last 20 years, then, there have clearly been major multiplying factors, right? The first one, and the most obvious one, and the one that criminologists always look at, is the fact that, sadly, the vast majority of violence is caused by males aged between 16 and 30. And in 2005, just as violence was taking off in Mexico, Mexico had a lot of men aged between 16 and 30, right? They are, to a certain extent, now aging out. And perhaps that is one reason why we've seen a kind of decline in homicide figures over the last few years. The second thing that Mexico had to cope with was that Mexico, for the first time during the early 2000s, got its own drug market, right? So up to that point, part of the agreement between the state and the traffickers was don't sell drugs in Mexico. And that's right, we got extraordinary, talking to kind of hitmen who were working in Ciudad Juarez in the 1990s. They say, it's like, I was a cocaine addict. I needed cocaine to help to cope with the stress of being a kind of hitman. But they couldn't get cocaine in Ciudad Juarez because the head of the Juarez cartel had banned cocaine there. So they had to go to El Paso to buy bad, massively cut, overpriced cocaine, right, for themselves, right? So, however, those agreements broke down, and from the 2000 onwards, Mexico has had a extremely high, or extremely kind of problematic drug market to the extent that if any of you are ever in Mexico City on the 28th of October, I would encourage you to go to the chapel of San Judas Tadeo, who has basically been turned into the patron saint of Mexico City's drug users. And you can follow the people about it as they go and sniff glue, sniff paint thinner, smoke crack, smoke methamphetamine, smoke weed, and go to a mass in San Judas de Tadeo's honor, right? So there is a growing drug market in Mexico. The third thing, and the thing that I think we all know about, is that the US has flooded Mexico with guns over the last 20 years or so. 2004 was the kind of big change in the gun law, which allowed the sale of semi-automatic guns. There are huge amounts of information now. We have 70 to 80% of all the guns captured in Mexico come from the United States. I think perhaps a more telling figure is that during the 1990s, no one murdered with a gun, right? 17% of murders with a gun, right? It was much more, you would like to be knifed or macheted or something like that. Nowadays, it's approaching 80% of murders are with a gun, right? Guns make killing easier. I probably don't have to say this to an American audience. Okay, sorry. So one of the arguments, and I'm kind of putting together a bit of a follow-up to the dope, is that nowadays in Mexico, what we're seeing is not one drug war, but essentially three interlinking wars running together. The first is an extension of that old protection racket, right? You have criminal groups who are now not simply extracting protection money from drug dealers or from other criminals, but also people who run in the illicit economy, right? The group to do this first was a group called the Zetas, who were basically former special forces officers who were frankly pretty crap at drug trafficking, right? So what they were very good was intimidating populations, right? Like the army had done for a long time in Mexico. So they just rode into cities like the city of Oaxaca. They normally kidnapped the head of police and the major, the lawyer who worked for the big business families, and said to them, right, who earns big money here? How much do they earn? How much do they pay us in tax? And they rounded up all the businessmen, and they were basically forced to pay tax to the Zetas. So a lot of the violence that is going on in Mexico today is not really about drugs at all. It's about the extortion market. It's about the protection racket, right? The second thing I want to say is still to this day, a lot of the violence is basically extrajudicial killing by police forces, right? Most famously, I think it was January this year, we were confronted with this extraordinary footage of the Mexican military, or the Mexican Marines shooting dead certain cartel members, and then the video showed them quite deliberately kind of changing the scene so it looked like the drug traffickers had actually been shooting at the military, right? They hadn't been, they were shot in cold blood. But there's loads of information that is now coming out about extrajudicial killings, particularly during the period kind of 2008 to 2012, the final 4 years of Calderon's government. There's an amazing book that was just written by the New York Times journalist called Fear is Just a Word, and he's collected plenty of information that demonstrates quite clearly that the military and the Marines employed a shoot-to-kill policy against anyone suspected to be a Zeta. And he estimated somewhere in the region of 2,000 Zetas, from the kind of high-up leaders down to the kind of street dealers, were killed quite deliberately in cold blood in the so-called Ley Fuga by the Marines. The third war that is happening in Mexico is a war on the street over drug sales, right? This is about small gangs fighting over who gets to sell methamphetamine or crack to 2 or 3 blocks of addicts in places like northern states like Tijuana, but also in some of the kind of deindustrialized zones of the center as well. So as I say, I think nowadays, rather than being these kind of big cartel battles, we've got these 3, very kind of violent wars going on at the same time. I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome. Thank you very much. Right, okay.
The floor is open to questions, responses, conversations, and I think we're going to want to, if we can, share microphones so that we want to look forward. We got it. Have you left us speechless?
Hi, thank you. When we were in Mexico in 1972, and we visited friends in Saltillo, they told us already that the guns were coming into Mexico. So I think 20 years is optimistic. I think closer to the 1970s, the guns started coming in.
Were really pushing the idea that guns were coming in and they were going to left-wing guerrillas. And in actual fact, there were a load of guns coming in, but the vast majority of them, the Mexican Secret Service did an investigation, were actually going to cops because basically Mexico didn't have enough, wasn't producing any guns and couldn't get enough guns for its cops. So a lot of the guns were not going to drug dealers or to guerrillas. They were mostly going to policemen, they found out. Which is not perhaps terribly comforting if you know much about policing in Mexico, but they weren't necessarily going to the quote unquote criminals.
For use or for marketing?
Mostly for use.
Yeah.
Mostly for use. So you would only really get a gun if you're a comandante. Otherwise, you had to buy a gun from your comandante, and it was way cheaper to buy a dodgy one from America, basically. But the Americans it was quite interesting just before the Americans were about to launch Operation Condor, they created what I now think are some fairly fictitious judicial cases, which claimed that these drug traffickers were selling guns to left-wing rebels in Guerrero, which I now think is complete nonsense. But the Americans were very, happy to at least pretend that was true.
Study, who was bringing the guns in?
Oh, I mean, there were absolutely loads of these. I mean, it's a bit like now, right? You just get loads of small scale smugglers. The same people who were smuggling TV sets, right, or stolen cars would then be smuggling drugs as well. So just the kind of, very small scale border smugglers, basically.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I would like to know how fentanyl is changing the drug market and these 3 wars you mentioned.
It's a really good question. So one thing that has clearly happened, a very good article by Johan Grillo out this weekend. I wrote a policy paper about it back in 2019. It's completely changed the geography of the drug trade in Mexico. Up to really 2017, it was rural areas of Guerrero, Oaxaca, even Sinaloa, Durango, Chihuahua. They were places that you grow marijuana and you would grow amapola, you would grow opium poppies. You now don't need to grow these things, right? So the price, some people have still grown opium poppies, but the price has gone down the toilet, right? I mean, it's about, I think Johan's recent figures were, it was about a fifth or a sixth of how much it cost in kind of 2018, 2019. We were seeing this in 2019. Guerrero farmers were coming to my co-author Roman and going, "We can't afford. I mean, this is, we're not getting any money for our amapola." A friend of mine was working in, Nat, working up in Nayarit, and he was saying there was no fiesta this year, right? Because because no one was buying their opium, right? So this is created these kind of, has meant now. What has that done? It's often meant that organized crime groups that used to buy people's opium and marijuana had turned to other ways of making money, other more violent ways of making money. So chasing peasants off land, right? Fighting over government subsidies for farmers. I mean, these are now recently we've had an extraordinary footage of farmers lynching members of the Familia Michoacana cartel who were shaking them down for, 10, 20% of profits on agricultural products. We've had the story of, Mexico State chicken. We've had the Familia Michoacana were shaking down Mexico State's chicken farmers, so they were charging them 30% of their profits, so they had to put the price of chickens up 30%. Right, so they moved to other forms of crime. Right, what has fentanyl done? I mean, how much fentanyl is being taken in Mexico seems to be, and maybe you can speak more. This seems to be basically a number that Mexicans don't want to really talk about. There's lots of tales that there is now fentanyl getting into the legal drug supply and stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of frightening times. But yes, it is completely changed. The other thing I will say is it's completely changed. It's made the drug trade really transnational in the way that it kind of was beforehand. So previously, during the early 2000s, the drug traffickers made links to China, basically to get in precursors for methamphetamine. And then they would, I remember going to Lázaro Cárdenas, port of Lázaro Cárdenas in about 2014, and it looks like kind of Mad Max. It was full of steel and iron scrapyards because they were sending this stuff to basically build cities in China. And allegedly the money the Chinese were paying in basically precursors for methamphetamine. Now there is a link to China and India and Germany when they're taking in precursors of fentanyl. Again, I think been covered very recently by Inside Crime in a very kind of professional article. So that is, as a kind of cultural, as somebody who is interested in, I suppose, the culture surrounding the drug trade, one thing that I've noticed is similar to the corridos tumbados, right? Lots of corridos tumbados, right? They'll have the usual Mercedes, gold-plated AK-47, and then random Chinese person in the background. Look, that's that guy there. And it's because it's a nod to this link they have now to Chinese precursor. Very kind of great. They appear kind of randomly in the background. These kind of corrido videos. Right. So yeah, many changes.
Hello. Yeah. I thought the presentation was really well done. I've read some other authors talk about the role of NAFTA in the 90s cartelization of Mexico, and I'm just curious as to your thoughts on how NAFTA may have encouraged some of that, I guess, centralization and also violence.
Basically makes two big structural changes, right? So I was talking a bit about the kind of demographic bump that you have in the late 2000s. Well, what NAFTA does is it screws over peasant farmers, who basically the peasant market for corn. Mexico is flooded by Midwestern corn, so it puts loads of people out of business. So they start growing weed or growing opium poppies because basically you can make no money out of corn and beans and calabaza anymore. That's pretty clear. The second big structural thing is it kind of dumps on Mexican big industry. So you have a lot of kind of urban young men who no longer have jobs in the big factories. So two big structural changes that allow for the drug trade to come in. The third big change is it's basically meant that you have a massive increase in the flow of traffic from Mexico into the United States. So it's Peter Andreas, who did this extraordinary study where he worked out there are 18 million trucks that went from Mexico into the US every year. And if you wanted to contain all the cocaine, right, for the entire year's use, when America's really into cocaine, you needed 13 trucks, right? So you're trying to find 13 trucks out of 18 million. Now, the Rand Corporation has come up with a figure that in order to find all the fentanyl that you need in the United States, you have to find half a truck among 50 million that are now crossing the border. It's basically impossible. So that's kind of what NAFTA.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I am starting to think about all of the presidential, I was starting to think about all of the political candidates that have been murdered in this electoral cycle and how many of these killings have been attributed to drug cartels. I was wondering how you see those killings fit into this framework of the three interlinked wars that you mentioned, and also this electoral cycle more broadly in terms of what it means for government policy towards violence that is narcotics driven.
That's a really good question. I mean, this is, I'm sure you know, this is dealt with, you sound like a person who's read the kind of Trejo and Lay stuff with two political scientists. To me, right, okay, that's good. So they have done, and their new study is about to come out. Where I see this happening, what I see happening is effectively, because cartels now, or drug trafficking, organized crime, whatever you like to do, they control territory, and they normally control territory in quasi-alliance with state forces. Sometimes they just employ the police to go and shake people down. Other times they just tell the police to get out of the way when they're shaking people down, or they're forcing people to, build monster truck tanks. So effectively, the bloodshed over elections is attempts by cartels and sometimes their allies in certain political parties to gain control of a particular territory, right? So they can A, sell drugs in that territory, and B, they can run this kind of protection in this territory. So it's kind of linked at least to two of those.
Hey, Ben.
Hello.
Great presentation. Thank you. I have two questions, not related. First one is among your source documents, I don't see court case documents, and I wondered how important those are to you. Of course, the Sam and Penny Lay's work, that they come up over and over again, but I wondered for your history.
So they were enormously important, actually, and I didn't say my second of my great my findings were I discovered that Mexico has federal court records for every state in state archives called Casas de Cultura Jurídica, and these have all the federal cases about drugs from 1900 to 1950. Everything post 1950 is in a series of really, the Mexicans have them, but they allowed, it's really so Mexican. We found out where they were. They're just outside Toluca in the Estado de Mexico, and we went there for 2 days, found that they have pretty much, somebody leaked us a catalog. So we managed to find some extraordinary cases which basically delineating counter-narcotics effort in the 1970s and 1980s, also showing quite clearly the Mexican state using horrendous levels. And then the Mexican government basically closed that archive, and no one's been in there since. So yes, court records have been important, certainly for the pre-1950 period. Post-1950, Mexico, they were very difficult to get hold of. Writing this new book about I'm writing a new book about the kind of history of the cartels from 1990 to 2020. I found court records, kind of stuff that journalists and use on the US side to be extremely useful. Really fascinating. I mean, going through the Chapo's court records or some amazing. I mean, one thing that is interesting is because of the death of regional journalism in the United States, a lot of these court cases are not really covered, right? So yeah, things that are happening in El Paso or Houston are not being covered by local journalists. So you kind of have to be in the know to find out where these things are. But yeah, they're extremely useful. Yeah, undeniable.
Thank you. And the second question is on your homicide rate graph, you see these central Mexican towns that historically have not been places of high violence or drug trafficking, Celaya, Irapuato. In terms of your kind of three war construct, where do they fall in this as a war zone?
Yeah, so on the one hand, they are fights over local protection rackets, and one thing they are fighting over there is protection rackets for the oil industry, right? So it's fights between different kind of cartel state alliances to control oil theft, right? So you have the Santa Lima, you know, Santa Rosa de Lima fighting the Cartel Jalisco. On the second thing that is really important is these places were big industrial centers with now, sadly, large drug markets in them. So they're fighting, these are often fights on the streets over, yeah, who gets to sell drugs in a particular area, not dissimilar to what is going on in Tijuana, for example.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have three questions. The first,
Okay.
The first one relates to how do you factor in migrant trafficking and human trafficking into the new portfolio of criminal drug traffickers or criminal organizations in Mexico? Then, if there is some way of systematizing the reactions of the communities vis-a-vis drug cartels, you can talk about internal displacement, migration, paramilitary groups, but whether you can systematize this throughout the history that you just told us. And finally, we see that in, for example, Brazil and Ecuador, prisons are places where drug traffickers keep on doing their business. And I'm wondering whether that's the case in Mexico. And if that's not the case, why? What explains that difference between the way that prisons work, perhaps, or the way, yeah, I think is the way the prisons work. Yes.
Really, really good questions that I really should have written down. So I remember the first one, however, was about, okay, I'm going to start with prisons and then go backwards. In terms of prisons, I mean, I completely agree. I think that loads of agreements, alliances are made in Mexico's big prisons. Frankly, we have no access to these, right? Except very recently, well, I mean, I'm sure my colleagues here have read this beforehand, but read the works of, there's a guy called Jesus Lemus, who was, you've heard of this guy? He was imprisoned on totally trumped up charges by basically the Calderon government by saying the Calderon family were involved in connections to the Familia Michoacana. He gets stuck in Mexico's Supermax prison and then writes two extraordinary books where he interviews Mexico's top drug traffickers and finds out the dynamics of that prison are incredibly important for understanding the dynamics of alliances between cartels. So he finds out. So I think prisons play a massive but probably underrated and understood role in the drug trafficking industry. Can I systematize popular reactions to what has been going on? Not off the bat now, but there's one thing that I would like to bring up is the issue of autodefensas, right? Which we saw in 2013. For those of you who don't know, there was a massive kind of wave of groups that stood up in arms against, well, they said against the drug cartels. The more I look into this, the more I see it as as the cartels during that period, particularly in Michoacan, were waging what is almost close to a kind of class war against the rural bourgeoisie. They were extorting and kidnapping and treating extremely violently the traditional leaders of Michoacan villages, right? These were mostly young men right from the margins of society who were taking advantage of the guns and the wealth and the prestige the Familia Michoacana gave them, and they were waging this class war. So the autodefensa movement was almost, and this is not very popular, so you certainly can't say that, it was a reaction of the petit bourgeoisie to this almost, as I say, primitive class insurrection there. So in other places, the drug traffickers have been extremely clever at tying themselves into those village elites. So you had no autodefensa movement in Sinaloa because the Sinaloan traffickers are really, I mean, they are the village elites, right? They put their family are in the village elites, and they don't allow these kind of upstart kids to run the drug trade or whatever. So I think that's my one interesting point. And you had one other question early on. Migrant trafficking has always been part of that protection racket, right? So, since frankly the 1920s, governors would control the drug trade, the liquor smuggling business, and the migrant smuggling business. That was the triptych of things you could make money from. obviously the money you can get from migrant trafficking goes up and down depending on basically variety of factors, Mexican economy, American economy, and whether the Americans have a kind of way like the Bracero program to let migrants in. Nowadays, because there is a very harsh kind of border force, as a result, they can make huge quantities of money from migrant trafficking. So I think the recent figures we have is it's worth, people think now, somewhere around $15 billion. And if the drug trade's worth what, 30 to 40 billion, I mean, that's a hell of a lot of money, right? That is passing through this. Yeah. I'm not going to say, I won't say the last thing. Don't worry.
And on that point,
Good.
these conversations will continue. I am certain the topics raised in the questions will come up again. I am going to simply say, we'll offer you all 2 to 5 minutes to stretch your legs, grab something to drink, exhale, we'll reassemble in about 5 minutes and move forward. ongoing presentations and conversations. So it is now my equally great pleasure to introduce Penny Ramirez, currently co-CEO and executive director of Futuro Media. I will say with roots that begin in Cuba, pass through Mexico, Veracruz, Mexico City. She was a lead investigative reporter for Univision in Mexico City for many years, remains a weekly columnist for Reforma in Mexico City, got producer Latino USA, et cetera, done amazing reporting on the student killings at Ayotzinapa in Mexico, was a major part of, if any of you saw the Frontline presentation on Uvalde, Penny had a major role in producing that. And she published now, more than a couple of years back, Los Millonarios de la Guerra, El Expediente Inédito de Garcia Luna. And so we invited her to particularly focus upon the more recent, still historic, links between the Mexican government and the drug cartel world. And
can you hear me well? Okay. Thank you all. Welcome. And thank you for the amazing presentation, Ben. I'm a big fan of your work as much as I'm a fan of Sam's work. So it's my pleasure to be here with both of them. Because I think that our work, the work that I have been doing on the ground in Mexico for more than a decade now, it's the perspective that you get from the work that you both have been doing. It's really important when you are on the ground doing this kind of not easy and of course dangerous work. So I want to start by a little story as well about why I had ended up so interested in fentanyl in particular as my work for the last years. I was here in Georgetown, invited by John last year, and I discussed mostly my investigation regarding one of the people that you had in your presentation, Genaro Garcia Luna, who has been, according to my husband, my most stable relationship because I have been investigating him for a while. He's now in jail, awaiting sentence in New York. But something that I have been doing, so my life after my most stable relationship got in jail, and he was not doing new stuff, so I need to get busy with something else besides trying to understand the case. Was mostly something that happened in connection with something that Benjamin was explaining, which is this paper that was published, I think it was October of 2019, by the Mexico Institute of the Wilson Center, and it was co-authored by Ben with two amazing investigators based in Mexico, Nathaniel Morris and Roman Lecor. And they were basically saying something that Ben's explaining a little bit, which was like, oh my God, there is a big problem right now happening in Nayarit mostly, and Guerrero, that is like Amapola doesn't have a market anymore. And nobody is basically buying it. And I have a couple of things of details, bear with me because my notes are disorganized. Is like, according to your paper, Ben, you had $1,000 million in the economy of opio back then. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, $1,000 million back in 2017. So those are numbers from 2017. At that moment when we're still, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be connected with some of the things that I'm sure that that Sam is going to explain, which is you have this historical change of going from, as Benjamin was explaining, from mainly marijuana to then marijuana and cocaine, to then cocaine and heroin and meth, to then, and a little bit of crack and crystal that is still big in Mexico in terms of local consumption. But then it comes what you could call the big business, that is basically fentanyl these days. So something that happened is at that point, and to try to respond, as Ben said, well, why I have been writing this story, fentanyl in Mexico is my main work related drug that I have been doing for the last 4 years. And it's basically because I was so bored of producing more and more stories about El Chapo. I was working for Univision back then. I worked for Univision for 7 years, and Univision, it was like these restaurants where you can have like a buffet that all you can eat. In my case, was all you can write about El Chapo. It's like they were never, ever bored in the noticiero because the rating of El Chapo was and still is so high that I can pitch 100 story. And actually, I did the count. It's almost 100 story that I did over those years about El Chapo, and they will always say yes. But at that point, I was like really bored about writing about him as much fascinating as the guy and his character and the entire story around him could be. And I became more and more interested in the process. So it's not that much about this charismatic character of El Chapo and the people he was, surrounded by, but how the business was working. So something that interested me was related to something I did in 2016. So in 2016 and 2017, what I did is I worked on a documentary about how the marijuana was transported from South Mexico, some parts of South border, and how it was transported to the mountains of Sinaloa, a place that we call El Triángulo Dorado, which is where you find these 3 states, Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, and how it was then transported into the border to then move to the United States. And what I found is it was, of course, really hard to get access to go there because my main assignment with Univision at that point was, how's life after Chapo in the mountains? This is after he was caught after the 3rd time that he escaped from a maximum security prison. So we went there to try to understand what was going on with the traffic at that point. And what I found out is that there was a little party in the mountains at that moment, and they were celebrating the big fires in California that were happening and spreading in California. And the reason why they were celebrating in this celebratory mood is because a lot of legal fields of marijuana in California were part of the fire. So they were like, the clients are coming back. At that point is one of those aha moments in journalism when you go really on the ground and you really understand how things are connected in a way that, of course, a politician or even a policymaker sitting in a desk in Mexico City or Washington, D.C. cannot never figure out. They will never think why, a bunch of campesinos in the mountains of Sinaloa will be so happy because of the fires in California. But basically, it was a big lesson to me about how the whole market was interconnected. So this was early 17. The piece was aired later in 2017. So when I read this paper, co-author by then in 2019, I said, maybe this is what I'm looking for, because by then my assignment was, you need to find a fentanyl lab. My boss asked me, because again, it's life after El Chapo. So now it's Chapitos. So El Chapo has, he's a person who is, deeply in love. He has been deeply in love several times in his life. And his family works in this like old school narco dynamic of the family belongs together no matter who is the mother. So they have a really close relationship. Most of the sons, starting with Ivan, who is the older one that is turning, I think, 41 or 42 right now. And the other 4, Ovidio, Alfredo, and Joaquin, are all around mid-30s, closer to 40s. So they're all part of the same generation, along with another one that was killed in 2008. So why was this important? It's because it was a new generation of people taking over a business that was played. And all of this is, of course, it doesn't mean that other cartels in Mexico had other processes, but the importance about talking about Sinaloa cartel in particular, because first it was the one that it was taking more and more money in terms of, the United States investigations. The DA was using the example of the Sinaloa cartel all the time to go to the Congress and ask for more and more money, as they keep doing. And the second is because at that point, I was trying to understand if fentanyl was, if it was true, something that I was told by a source in Mexico City, that is that the real reason why the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, who is the other cartel, was bigger and was meant to be bigger than the Sinaloa is, and this is quote, because they haven't understand fentanyl. The Sinaloa haven't understand fentanyl. So I was at that point really interested in trying to see if this was true, if this was like the Sinaloa was this old school focusing on cocaine and they didn't really get fentanyl. So I felt that Benjamin's paper saying that, Amapola is dying, nobody's buying it. And it was based mainly in Nayarit and Guerrero, and said, what's happening in Sinaloa? And of course, the way I pitch it is what's happening in Sinaloa after El Chapo, now with this business. And of course, it was approved. And of course, I was sent to Sinaloa to try to find it on the ground. And something I did when I was on the ground is to try to find a lab. And at the point, I'm happy because one of the images that that Benjamin just show is one of the footage that I got for that story. That was like I was looking for the laboratory. I was coming into this. Maybe it's a little naive, so I was looking for the lab. I don't know if we can just maybe put it again, because it's and you will see my disappointment, because it was basically, a place in the middle of nowhere with almost nothing, and people wearing this special equipment. I went there in January of 2020. So at that point, I didn't even could think that the COVID pandemic will happen, and that we will be so familiarized with this kind of clothes. And thank you, because I didn't have anything. No, is the go back? Yeah. This one. Okay. So as you can imagine, I came to this place so excited about finding the laboratory, and this is what I found, basically. So it's, it's the middle of the jungle in the Sinaloa. But what is important about the picture, you cannot really see it from here, but it's what is here. So in the top of this tank, like blue tank, they had a little package. And I asked them, thank you, Ben, so much. And what they had in the package, I said, what is that? And they said, that's how you say in English, precursor? Okay, the precursor of fentanyl. And they said, oh, and I said, where do you get that from? And they said, we get it from Germany. And I said, oh, and who brings that from Germany to you? And they said, the ladies that walk in the middle of the airplanes, which is the best description ever. The pretty ladies that walk in the middle of the on the airplanes. And that started an investigation that I have been carrying on for a while now, trying to understand how this big market in Mexico, my main focus has been the Sinaloa cartel, but it's been happening with other organizations, have been switching, and I'm pretty sure that Sam will explain this better and further than me, switching from mainly, the big profits of cocaine to the big profits of fentanyl. And I think that will respond back part of your question before. So what has been the story of this? So basically, according to the sources I have been able to trace, the first receipt for creating fentanyl was received at least in Sinaloa and some parts of Baja California in 2014. There's a really good article recently from Inside Crime that they use, that they have a great explanation of the different methods, saying that they had the Siegfried method and the Gupta method that is, according to the DEA, the one that they're using right now to produce fentanyl. And basically what they have been saying is consistent with what my sources have been telling me on the ground, which is that they got the receipt, that as they call it, and they called the receipt because the way that the people making this, the people in the picture that we saw, are called the cookers or the cocineros. So that's why you have all this chef metaphor around the whole thing. And then it was about to try to understand, my work has been trying to understand how much of the process happens in Mexico. And basically it's because there is a big question. And I think this is also a big point of tension between what the Mexican government has been saying and what the US government has been saying. So basically, the US government has been saying for years, there are clandestine labs in Mexico. Mexican government has been saying there are no labs in Mexico. So for example, for this story, I went to the same day of Culiacanazo. I didn't, of course, knew that that was the day of Culiacanazo, but I went to the Mañanera, which is the daily conference of the Mexican president, and I asked him, what is your government doing to stop the production of fentanyl? And he responded, oh, we are destroying laboratories every day, all the time. And I said, okay, but I have a database from your own administration saying that there are almost no laboratories destroyed. And he said, oh, we'll give you the information later. And when they gave me the information said there are no laboratories in Mexico. So it's like the Mexican presidency contradicting the Mexican president, which is, of course, not a surprise, considering what's the craziness that has been in the last years with, that conference in particular, that daily conference in particular. So what has been happening later is that as the US have been trying to push into more involvement of the Mexican government and to try to stop this and to try to really understand how much of the process is happening in Mexico, specifically with fentanyl, what Mexico has been doing, and I wrote it down to tell you because it's really funny, the different names that they have been coming up. So they call it, first, of course, they said there are no labs. So they call it the workshops, no labs, workshops. And they call it, this is the most recent one, the manufacturing centers. So again, no labs, manufacturing centers or workshops. So you can call it whatever you want, but the reason, the reality is that, and this is the important part of the story, that it's been an increase in the production of fentanyl in Mexico, that's for sure. It started all the way back in 2014. It is true that if you go to the documents, mainly of the DEA, they have traced fentanyl in Mexico since 2014. It is true that the Mexican government, if you ask them, the first document that I have obtained, it's really funny, is from 2015. And they say they might be something that they call something like fentanyl. And at that point, the cartels have been doing it for a year already. And this is the first time and I see a document and they say, well, maybe there is something that they will call, but it was not a concern for the Mexican government until I will say 2018, 2019, even, but really starting in 2020. But if you go to how things have been changing, there is data from DEA from 2017. So the seizures from those years said that the Mexican fentanyl or synthesized in Mexico were having a purity of 5 to 10%. So at that point, it was still this experimenting phase of the laboratories. What's been happening is like last year's annual report from the DEA, so it's data from 2022, the purity has increased to almost 14%. So it is a big learning curve if you consider how difficult in the production is and the way that this is being produced, like the picture that we just saw. Thank you again to Benjamin. I should have brought my own pictures. So what has been happening right now is like, and this is where is the connection about why the story about people happy about the fires in California matter, but what is happening with the fentanyl is as more and more people in like frankly, like Sam have been documenting what is happening with this big, enormous overdose crisis in the United States and how it is a major health issue and concern in this country, and how the authorities have been saying and the CDC has been saying this is a major crisis, we need to do something about it. Then slowly the investigations in Mexico have been going in to try to understand what is going on, how it's processed, etc. And another thing that it's been like a secret, which is if there is consumption of fentanyl in Mexico or not. Of course, the government, they say there are no laboratories. So if there are no laboratories, there is no consumption, but it's because basically it's nothing to consume. But that's of course not true. The recent data that we have, there is one article that was published in the late last year that says that 2 of 4 cocaine samples that they analyzed for the article were containing fentanyl in Mexico, and 14 of 22 amphetamine samples were containing also fentanyl. And there's another good article that was published last year about a study that was made basically in Baja California about oxycodone pills that were sold in Mexican pharmacies and were containing 30% of fentanyl. And after that article came out, the LA Times went out to Mexico and tried to redo the exercise, and they found that 70% of the pills that apparently were oxycodone, they were containing fentanyl. So there is an increase in the consumption in Mexico, even with this so-called rule by the cartels that there is, this prohibition of selling and consuming fentanyl in Mexico. It is still happening. And in the case of Mexico, what is worried is as the government admits that there is a problem, they're not, of course, doing nothing about it because there is no problem to resolve. So basically, they have been denying even that this is happening. And what we have, and this is mostly journalists, from journalists in I would say in the north of Mexico. The most recent, I think, better article about it is an article that was published in February of this year in using data from the General Prosecutor's Office of Nuevo León about the increase in cases of people dying in Nuevo León. And I brought some numbers for you. So it was one case positive to something related to fentanyl in 2013, 47 cases in 2018, and 180 cases in 2023. And this is just Nuevo León. So something that you will see is that you will see down the border an increase in the local cases, an increase in the denial from the government, but also something else and that is happening, and I think is very important, which is connected with what is happening here. And talking about the things that you can learn from court cases, as was asked before, is that the U.S., in my case, now I'm based in New York, so it's harder for me to do work on the ground. I have been doing, of course, less work on the ground in Mexico. But what has been useful recently is to follow a series of cases that have been filed in the last 2 years, mainly in the United States, against Chinese companies. So what's happening right now is that you have some cases that were presented in Florida, some cases in California, in Texas, in New York. If you follow those cases, you can try to reconstruct what is happening with the investigation of the DEA. And basically, this is the story. For the last 5 years, but mainly most of the anecdotal evidence that we can get from court cases right now is from 2021 and 2022. The DEA has been conducting a major investigation to try to understand how this company that is based mainly in Wuhan and other Chinese provinces near Beijing. So basically what they have been doing is tracing down these companies, are small companies, legal companies, pharmaceutical companies, and they have nice websites that you can go and see, and they're alive right now. And they have been advertising in pharmaceutical websites in other places like Mexico or Canada or the United States. And they have been also advertising in Twitter, in TikTok recently, in Facebook, and they have been selling something that is the most important one that I think they're saying right now, that is a 4-piperidone. So why the 4-piperidone, if you haven't heard about this number, is important? Because when the recipe starts in 2014, and this is really technical, so I won't get that much into that. They were creating, they needed two different precursors to get into the finished product. But what has been changing in the last years is that they changed it to another method that is called the Gupta method. And with this other method, the process that you need to do to create the fentanyl only needs one precursor mainly, which is the 4-piperidone. And what has been happening right now is that the DEA has been trying to trace how the sale is made and also how the transportation is done. And the transportation is done mainly by US mail. It's not that we're surprised about it. By UPS in some cases, it is paid mainly in crypto. Again, not a big surprise because crypto has been the way that most of the big money in the narco world, it's been floating in recent years. So basically what is funny is the code number. So the number that at least the Mexican clients have been using a lot is at 79099. And right now the price is $240 per kilo. At least it was until the last case was brought to justice. But the minimum that you can buy is 25 kilos. That means that just with one provider in Wuhan, you can feed enough for the entire city of Phoenix, for example. So the investigation is hard to trace journalistically because most of the people that have been accused are still in China. China is not gonna send them here to be in front of a, judge and a jury in the United States. So it's gonna be really hard to understand. There's this good book that was published some years ago, Fentanyl Inc., that explains a little bit about the system that, for these legal companies back in China. But right now what we know is that these companies are created there. There is a lot of geopolitical movement around what are the substances that need to be prohibited and need to be prohibited to be sold legally in China. There is a lot of negotiation happening around other things that are in the interest of the United States, like the war in Ukraine, like the crisis, what is being happening in Gaza. And this substance is in the middle of that big negotiations. That what the US has been doing right now is try to push the United Nations to do the negotiations through them and say this is a health concern. Again, I hope that Sam will elaborate more about this. But basically, the situation is that the United States has been trying to trace how the offer happens, and it happens, as I said, through these websites, through these social media sites, etc. How the transportation happens and is like sending like a regular package. They have been tracing several packages that are coming to Florida, they are coming to New York, they're coming to Canada, they're going to Mexico, and then how this is transformed into the final product, how it's sent in some cases, as the case that I for when I was there, in not in pills, to just send the raw product through the border to California. And this is also connected with the other question about human trafficking and human drugs. Most of the people who cannot afford to pay the coyote, they are paying with transportation. I'm working on another story right now about the big crisis that has been happening in the last months in the border of Arizona and Sonora, in a small place there called Sasabe, that is now a ghost town because of the repairing that has been happening in the wall, because we are in an election year and you need to repair the wall to say that I'm a Democrat, but I'm repairing the wall. I'm not letting the quote unquote invasion come. And what you're doing is you're distorting the whole movement of people, and again, the movement on drugs. So how this is connected, because there is a market that is still needing to be fed. And what is happening in the Mexican side, because it's also an election year, is that now Mexicans realize that some of it is happening through the ports like Lázaro Cárdenas, the one that Benjamin mentioned, but most of it is arriving via the International Airport of Mexico City. There have been reports of several seizures through the airport, mainly from 2018, but it's really not that much. It's 300 kilos, 400 kilos, 200 kilos, which, if you go back to your sources, they tell, yeah, that's for a weekend for us. So it is something to fill out the reports and to present. A lot of these seizures happens around a visit of a big name on the United States government to Mexico. Every time that, when they were negotiating the bicentennial agreement, oh, there is a seizure in the Mexican City airport. Or when Blinken was going to Mexico, oh, there is another seizure, and there is a seizure in a laboratory in Culiacan. But it's all this performative, courts of justice. But what is really happening is that there is one single member of the Mexican Congress that is from Morena, the ruling party, that she has been trying to get more restrictions into the system, the forced piperidone, and nobody has been backing up her, not even her own party. This piece of legislation has been sitting in the U.S. government in the Mexican Congress for almost 2 years now, and nothing has been really doing anything about it. And just to wrap up with the Mexican elections and what's happening right now is, well, we will have elections in Mexico June 2nd, so months before the U.S. elections. I interviewed both of the leading candidates, and I asked them both about, what's your plan? What do you think you're gonna do? And it's, I will say, disappointed, to say it nicely. For example, Xochitl Galvez, who is the opposition leader right now and candidate, I told her, what are you going to do with this crisis and the immigration crisis, etc. And her response was, okay, I'm okay with Mexico being the wall, but they should give us more money to be able really to do it. And there was, all the response that we have had from both parties, frankly, is that they have big plans that include some sort of militarization, not really going over the increasing militarization that we have been having in the country. And I don't see so far any deep understanding or on the ground understanding about of course, not from both sides of the border, but not even from the Mexican side of the border. And I will say, even as a journalist that have been working most of my life in Mexico, I have a better understanding right now of what is happening in Mexico with this issue because of what's happening in courts in the United States, which is really disappointed and complicated, because it is true that the numbers are getting better a little bit. Part of the interviews that we have done with Claudia Sheinbaum, the leading candidate so far, and her team, they have been saying that they're, trying to get over almost 20 years of an increase in the number of people dead and people incarcerated and people killed, which is true. It is true. Partly because this other person that I have been investigating a lot, Genaro Garcia Luna, and, all the things, the corrupt things that he did. But it is also true that, and this is also connected with something that Benjamin explained, that partly what is happening is that you have an increased workforce that is willing to do this. And there is a piece of work that I think was nobody really pay attention to this in the United States, but I want to quote it here because I think it's really important. There is an investigator, a Mexican investigator that is based in Europe, and he wrote a really good article that was published like last year in Science magazine about the workforce of the narcos in Mexico. And according to his numbers, he said that it was between 160,000 and 185,000 people that were working for the narcos in Mexico. And the important thing about his work is about the recruitment pace, how fast you can replace people if they get incarcerated, if they are killed. And it was pretty fast, basically, also because of what Benjamin was explaining about you have a young population that is willing to do this for almost no guarantees, for almost no money, and for minimum rewards. So that's still happening. It is true that the numbers have been, I won't say getting better, but at least getting less worse than in previous administration. That is something important to acknowledge as well. But the understanding of the nature of the business and the nature of how interconnected it is between the deep roots of course, poverty, of course, corruption in, the local levels, of course, impunity that is still 98% of the judicial cases in Mexico, with the huge availability of workforce that you have, and a business that is highly profitable, that you can make a lot of money with such a short investment in terms of people, in terms of, supply, and also in terms of equipment, because especially, and that's why I mentioned this method, because you don't need to invest almost anything to really get, big profits. So I want to leave it there. I have some other ideas maybe we can share at the end, but I'm curious about, I don't want to take up more floor for things that I'm pretty sure that Sam will explain.
Thank you very much. And once again, we will open the floor to conversation.
Thank you. Penny Lay, let me tell you that I read your column every Saturday in Reforma, and I follow you in podcasts, and I admire very much the work you're doing. I want to ask you on the last part. You say that you have not found in both candidates sort of a proposal of what to do. What would you tell them to do?
Well, I think every time I get, thank you for that also. I think I have a good example of something I found on the ground in one of those trips. I was a local mayor, and I think he was an example of how could be a way to do it. And it's not just from Mexico. There are some examples in Colombia as well, which is understanding that that's the people you govern, that's the people that is under you. And we were just in the break, we were talking about our dear friend that we always miss, Javier Valdez, who was killed in Sinaloa. And what Javier coverage told us is that humanizing narcos was not against the rules of journalism. And I think that it could go the same for politicians. The thing is that this is sort of what López Obrador has been trying to do with the abrazos, no balazos rule, but he can tell this, and he can go and, shake the hand of the mother of El Chapo when she was alive. But at the same time, you have increasing the militarization in the country. You have been increasing the money for, the same strategy that Calderon had. So I always say that there are some things that, were proposed in the early 2000s that we have said that they are not good enough. And basically was like really trying to provide other opportunities, really try to control the flows of money, which to me is always the big response. Try to control the sources of income, trying to control the supply. And that's what I have been talking specifically about this particular precursor and controlling the flow of it. Because if you control, to me, the flow of the supply in this case is really particular, because we know the name of the substance, we know where it's coming from, how it's coming from. If you control that, at least you force whoever is making this substance to have a new learning curve. And that makes you gain some time, because they need to replace the whole system. They need to learn how to do it in another way. They need to move to something else. So to me, that is more effective than just putting all of them in jail, because first, as we saw with the book of Jesus Lemus, they are going to be keep operating from jail. Second, the recipe, because one of the things that I have been asking my sources is I'm really interested in the process of how things get made. So I have been asking them how you learn, how was the recipe transmitted to you? And it's funny because it's like these YouTube videos, or it's like, you know, when my kids have a homework that I don't know, a project for the school that I don't know how to do, I Google it. And I put up this video on YouTube of how you do this. Well, how do you think that narcos are learning how to do this? They have the same access to technologies. But the thing is that if you don't have the supply of the basic things, even if you are learning fast how to do it, or you have another person that will take over control of the, you know, of the violence, of the control, etc., they at least you're gaining time with the learning curve. I will say that one thing. And the other thing is, like, it is true that we need a judicial reform in Mexico that helps with the level of impunity. The thing is that what I'm not in agreement is in the way that the government of López Obrador and then Claudia Sheinbaum is proposing to do it, which is basically get more and more power to the executive level over other, you know, judicial level and the Congress. Because the way that they have been saying that they're going to be do a judicial reform to try to combat the impunity is not, I'll say, in a democratic way, at least the way that they are presenting it. So I think that it is pretty basic. In other countries like this one, you have a lot of crime. I think there is no doubt that we have a lot of crime in the United States, but at least you have some sort of consequences for some people about the process, and you have some controls. And I think the United States not even is a good example, but there are other examples in other countries where if you have a better judicial system, and if you have a better control of the supplies and about a better understanding of the process of creation of the drugs and movement of the drugs, then you can at least control the supply, and therefore you will control the violence and you will control the flow of the money. And something that it's important is to understand that even if you're tracing something that is as difficult as crypto, there is a way to trace the money. Because I always think if the journalists, we can do without the scarce resource that we have. You know, in the case of Garcia Luna, I was able to trace $400 million myself in my computer. And I think if I really don't believe that the government cannot do that, cannot really trace the money, because they have access to resources that the journalists don't have access to. So I think is if someone is really confronted with this and you can really shorten the supply, that will make a big difference.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Could you please give us more detail about the role played by Germany in the process you just analyzed, please?
Well, that's a big mystery for me as well. I have been trying to trace it because it's really complicated. What I can say so far is that there is regulation in Germany that allows to move within the European Union, at least for this particular precursor. Something else that I have been learning is that in Mexico, you have, well, it's a bit different with this administration, but for many years, we have legal fentanyl that was used in hospitals like you have in other countries. Apparently, according to some sources, that was a way that they were extracting some of the precursors that were used mainly for laboratories in universities, etc. But what is interesting is that you try, and I spoke about this with a colleague from Der Spiegel last year, and it was not even in the map of the journalism right now in Germany. Not even for the colleague I speak with was the colleague that was leading the Panama Papers, and he's not in Der Spiegel anymore. He's in another project that he started. But the thing is that it it is a big mystery still to me. How is possible that the European Union hasn't really raising this flag yet in the way that, but what I have been trying to do is to try to find if the United States have been, reclaiming or saying or anything. And there are some hearings. There's one hearing that happened in Congress 2 years ago that sort of mentioned it. I think someone that I have been following a lot for understanding around this is Celina Realuyo from George Washington University. I think her hearing in the Congress is one of the most enlightening one, the hearings that I have been learning more from. But if you follow what the US authorities have been doing, they have been mainly focusing on China and these companies, from these provinces, especially Wuhan. I think that the investigation around Wuhan is started way, I will say 2017, because the book that I was referring, I think it was published in 2019, the Fentanyl Inc. book that was, to me, the first big attempt to try to understand how this big transnational market was operating. But of course, Wuhan was the epicenter of the pandemic in early 2020. So I understand why it took a while to really get into the flow of the investigation again. And that's why we don't have any relevant court cases until mid-2023 and late 2023, that the ones that happened in last year. But even in those cases, you don't have a single mention about Germany. It's everything about China. And there's one hearing that happened last year in the European Union, because I have been tracing, because I'm curious about it. And it was a single mention that it could be misuse, but no like a big flow. And of course, the seizure that have been announced in Mexican City Airport have been happening mostly from other countries, but never in flights that are coming directly from Germany. So I'll be happy to come back when I find out and tell you.
Pernille, I have two questions for you. First, thank you for your intervention. But then the two questions are whether you have used public health data, particularly overdose data, to understand whether people are dying or not from fentanyl, and whether in Mexico they have drug consumption surveys to understand what people are consuming, at what age they are starting. And then the second question relates to the demand side, because from Benjamin's presentation, we learned that Mexico has become a drug market on itself. And so I was wondering whether this government is doing something from the demand side. I know that there are two risk reduction programs that they don't have any more funding from the federal government. So I was wondering, how is Mexico preparing its own population to face this fentanyl epidemic?
Well, what I have seen is a couple of ads, and that's it. I haven't seen one of my best friends, and I think one of the best journalists of Mexico is about to publish a major book about health in the current administration. And the book it's basically following how this so-called reduction in cost in the government has been having really bad health consequences. I think that we still don't see that in terms of course, we don't see a big overdose crisis related to fentanyl in Mexico in the way that we have been seeing it in the United States. And again, I'm pretty sure that Sam will explain this better than me. But in the case of Mexico, what we have is a big lack of data, because we have people dying. We know that there is a big consumption still of cristal, of crack, less expensive drugs, at least in the center of Mexico. We see an increase in consumption in the north of Mexico. That's why I think it's so important that at least the state prosecutor of Nuevo León is now paying attention to the increase of these numbers. But at least from the numbers I just gave today, 180 cases over a year is still pretty low if we compare with the, these huge numbers that we're seeing in the United States. It is true that when I have been interviewing sources, they said that the Sinaloa cartel, at least the Sinaloa cartel, have been prohibiting from selling fentanyl. A couple of people that have been trying to sell fentanyl, they have been killed in this way that the Sinaloa cartel uses to, to give a lesson for others, etc. And it is true that they are scared of it. And it is also true, and this is partly why the Amapola business is kind of coming back in certain places of the country, because of the increase of people dying for overdoses and all the things that we have been seeing in the United States with these alerts, the increasing numbers, the CDC saying this is the major crisis besides the pandemic. This is the major health crisis that we're dealing with in the United States. What the result of that is, and I will say the way that they told me, because I have been asking my sources back in Mexico, what do you think about this crisis in the United States? And they said, well, I don't know that much about the crisis, but I know that my client in California or my client in Phoenix has been asking me to rebajar un poquito, so to mix it a little bit, and they have been mixing it mostly with Amapola. But it's like we have now in New York, it ads like are in the subway and everywhere saying how much it's a lethal doses of fentanyl. We don't know, you don't know, the government doesn't know. This is the way that, I'm just recreating the ads. And the thing is that, my sources, cooks in Sinaloa, don't know either, because the way that they have been producing this, unless you are one of El Chapo's relatives and they have these big laboratories that are up in the mountains, I haven't have access to those, but I know that they exist because of some of my colleagues. Besides those labs, there are just some of them, and I think that we'll learn a lot about those labs, the big labs, during the trial of Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo, once that trial starts. But just from the cases, specifically, I will say from the cases in Chicago, the indictment in Chicago and the indictment in the South District of New York, the one that was approved by the grand jury in April of last year, you will say that there is a lot of, big names involved in the process, but there's a lot of, less known names that are some of the ones that I have been interrogating or interviewing. And in those cases, that's my main concern, because when you don't understand really well the way that the cartels operate in Mexico, you think that they're like these big families, like Italian families, like La Cosa Nostra, or these movies that we have about Italian American families. And you think that is the father and everything goes down like in a perfect triangle and everybody's taken. But when you go on the ground, you see that it's not really like that. It's like you have different groups and you have different people. And really what really determines who is more important is who has the best client in the United States. So if you have a good client in Phoenix, you are going to be most important in that organization in that moment, because all the people will want to supply you because you are the ones who have the clients on the other side. And again, I think that Sam will explain this better because I have been studying a lot the other side, the US side more than me. But what is happening right now is that there is no strict or even quality control, because you have different groups supplying to different clients, supplying with different expectations about the quality. And that's why if you see in a map, the overdoses crisis in the United States is not even. And it is because you have different suppliers with different clients and different qualities. And I think that's something that we don't really understand from Mexico, because there is no enough information or enough like big picture investigation. Though the reports that we have been able to access is really anecdotal still. It's really what you can connect from the story that I did with other person and with other person and with other person. And it's important also to say it out loud. There is a big thing performatic happening right now, and going back to the beginning of my presentation, everybody wants to be like El Chapo. So everybody wants, a lot of times when I tell the story of I did this, I get this access, I went to this place, and you say, how you made them talk to you? And I said, because if you put a camera and you said, you can tell your story like El Chapo has been doing, they're going to say yes. So I think that we're lacking a lot of information to really understand, but I think what good approach is to try to determine the crisis by dividing it geographically and try to understand those flows. So for example, a big part of Sinaloa is crossing through California. You will see that also in Ovidio's case. You will see that a single supplier that was Ovidio's client in California was sending back to Mexico $24 million in just 2 years, from 2018 to 2020. And this is just one client. So we don't know if Ovidio is providing two different qualities to do different clients, and therefore you will have more people dying from the clients that are buying from that client instead of the other ones. So it is like these big corporations, and we need to think about the cartels as these big corporations that will bring, maybe it's, I will say names of large legal corporations, but we know from the legal businesses that you will have different qualities from the same company. And this is partly what I think is happening.
I'm gonna say again, we might take a quick 2 to 5 minutes. Everybody take a rest. All right. I will say it is an equal pleasure to welcome Sam Quinones to Georgetown and to our program here. Simply said, and I've mentioned to a couple of people informally, when I read Dreamland Now many years ago, I said, for the first time, I begin to understand the problem of drugs in the United States, in its post-industrial communities, in the Midwest, et cetera, in the heartland. It just opened my brain, and I thank him for that. As he knows, this is not the first time I have tried to recruit him to Georgetown. But you know, young kid like me, part of your career is you keep trying and you finally get it done and you pull it off. He has recently written The Least of Us. And I guess just from my perspective, not only did he make clear why the market grew and sustained in everyday communities in dissolution in mid-America before anybody else did, he also, to my brain, put corporate America, Pfizer, at the center of the conversation. And that part of it, at least from my perception, most of this country ignored for a couple. They waited a second round and people finally said, oh yeah, Quinones told us about that a while back. So again, I want to say I doubly appreciate. And now in The Least of Us, which along with Ben's The Dope will be for sale once we're done and the reception starts, he has taken up this explicit move to chemically produce fentanyl, which resonates with me because my entire career as a historian has been based on people producing agricultural products on the land and trying to live. And this is one of the last steps of taking lives of agricultural production on the land and just making them marketable. So it is with great thanks I welcome Sam Quinones.
Thank you very much, John. Really nice of you to that introduction. I appreciate also Penile and Ben for their presentations. Fantastic stuff. It's very interesting. It's really strange for me because most of the time I am all alone. I'm not. Is that working? You can hear it because I can't. Oh, is that what happened? Oh, okay. All right. Well, okay, there we go. I am really almost always doing my work alone. And so it's really a different feeling to be on a panel with other people who kind of do the same work. It's a weird feeling. But I mean, it's good. It's just strange. And I'm very glad to be here. My daughter was just admitted to this school, so I've been here over 2 or 3 days now with the new admissions fair the last couple of days and stuff. And so it's anyway, it's a brand new time for our family, that's for sure. So let me just tell you a quick story that I found very interesting. I told in The Least of Us, which is in 2005. They began to notice in Chicago, and let me put on my glasses so I can actually see you back there. Began to notice people dying in large numbers from a new kind of heroin. They thought it was a bad batch of heroin, and this was primarily in the South Chicago area, funneled into the street gangs that were around the Cabrini Green and other housing projects at that time. And they began to notice it and began to realize, and they made the mistake of saying, be careful, putting notices out, be careful. There's a very, very powerful form of heroin out there. Watch out. And as everybody does in the heroin world, that's not a warning, that's an advertisement. And so people began to flood the area, Eventually, the same heroin, because of the gangs it was trafficked to, began to be trafficked up to Detroit, St. Louis, Camden, and Philly, Cleveland, I believe, some other places. And you began to see in the fall of 2005 this dramatic death rate. Just remarkable. It was not like that before. It was like this, and then all of a sudden, boom, like that. And for 9 months, 10 months, people died by the thousands from this, or hundreds at first, but then eventually by the thousands in the total. Along the way, investigators began to understand, or came to understand, in the middle of this very, very desperate time where people were really freaking out, and the officials in Chicago didn't know what to do. The DEA and cops were trying to figure this out, that there was a lab in Toluca, outside Mexico City, that they came to find out was making what they had been involved from wiretaps, had been involved in what they called the project. That's what they called it on the wiretaps. This project, we're trying to figure out if this thing will actually form a market, right? And if we sell it, will they use it? And if they use it, will they use it more? Will they become? And sure enough, they began to hear on the wiretaps people saying, "Yeah, the project's working." They didn't know what it was. They called it on the phones. They called it heroína sintética, synthetic heroin. And of course, in the long run, it was not. It was fentanyl. It marked the first time that the Sinaloa. This was a wing, as Penny very, very interestingly and correctly said. To me, the cartels are not the GM of dope. It's this wide, robust ecosystem, throbbing ecosystem of actors, all of whom see their own interest, financial interest involved. They'll come, they go. It's not like some strict hierarchy. And so this was one arm of the Sinaloa drug cartel. Eventually, they due to some really good detective work by a DEA agent in Chicago, who went and interviewed a kid from that lab, who came to San Diego on the run, went into the DEA office and gave up the whole story. And so they eventually worked this whole investigation. They arrest the guy who runs the lab. They find the lab contains some of the best glassware they've seen. It's a very sophisticated lab. And this man, the man who runs it, is a guy named Ricardo Valdez Torres, also known as El Cerebro, the brain. And he is a Mexican, but lived most of his life in the United States, speaks better English than Spanish, and learned to make fentanyl in 20 years prior to that, was then arrested. He did it poorly. Was arrested, spent 15 years in prison where he learned to make fentanyl better. They deport him in 2004 to Hermosillo, where he's contacted by some people who don't know a thing about fentanyl. What they want him to make is ephedrine to make methamphetamine, because they can see that eventually the Mexican government is going to curtail the quantities of methamphetamine, of ephedrine, that they can get access to. Ephedrine being a decongestant that you use in Sudafed and these kinds of pills. He, believing himself to be the smartest man, not just in the room, but like in all of Toluca, says, "Yeah, okay, yeah, right, I'll make that. But you know what I'm really going to make is fentanyl." He doesn't tell them that until he's made it. They get mad. Not a good idea to make members of the Sinaloa drug cartel mad, but he sits them down. He says, "This is the most profitable drug you will ever encounter. Very, very little of this stuff. We're making a few kilos here. You can cut this." He says, "You can cut this 50 times. You can make 50 kilos from the 10 kilos I've just made." How do I know that? Because I just tested it on mice. At 50 to 1 cut, they don't die. The mice don't die. And they were like, "No, that's not possible. On the street, that sounds like a scam. Like you're trying to sell me some dope," and I'm like, 50 to 1 cut, there's no chance I'm going to take. That's going to make, and sure enough, at 51 cut is exactly what it needed. Problem was they didn't believe that up in Chicago either. And so they didn't cut it 50 times. They cut it 20 or 30 or whatever it was, but it was certainly not enough. And people began to die by the thousands. They bust that lab and the death toll stops. Right? It just ends in April of 06. And he is then debriefed at great length in a prison in Mexico City by two DEA agents, both of whom I interviewed, and it's from them that I get the story of Ricardo Valdez Torres. He's still in Mexico. Well, they deported him. He did time in the United States. Now he's back in Mexico somewhere. But whatever the case, this is when the Sinaloa drug cartel figures out that there is such a thing as heroína sintética or fentanyl. They did not know this. They had been providing heroin into our opioid epidemic for people who are addicted to pain pills provided aggressively by doctors. People switch to heroin. They're buying it mostly from people on the western side of Mexico, Nayarit, which is my story in Dreamland, my first book on this, and Sinaloa, these guys. But these guys really, at that point, they are really not about heroin. They are really about meth. This is beginnings. This is about the evolution of the Mexican drug trafficking world into what is now, I believe, the synthetic era of drugs, where they find that it is so much better, from their point of view, of course, to make your drugs rather than to grow them, right? So why? Well, all kinds of reasons that probably are pretty obvious to most of you already. You don't need sunlight. You don't need rain, farmers. You don't need, there's no seasons. All you really need is a shipping port, shipping ports, plural, where you can get access to the world's chemical markets. When you can do that, you can get all the precursors that you want to make your fentanyl and or methamphetamines we'll talk about in a minute. Indeed, this is where we are now. Ben touched a little bit on this. People have grown up, the traffickers in Mexico, rancheros. They're from these little tiny brutal villages out in the middle of nowhere in Michoacan and Sinaloa and Durango and Nayarit and different places. And the originals were, ranchers, farmers, barely making a living growing, whatever, melons or tomatoes or whatever it is. And along comes marijuana and boom, they become farmers times 10, right? And their grandchildren, so to speak, are now global chemical traders. They have, I think, generally forgotten about how to grow marijuana. I mean, it's like, I think it'd be very difficult to get them back doing the arduous work of growing marijuana after they've made fentanyl, every 3 days in a backyard lab. When I lived in Mexico, and I lived there 10 years, from 94 to 04, the peaceful years, the calm before the storm, I did not realize it was the calm before the storm. I thought it was just the way Mexico was. And then 2005, all hell breaks loose. And that, as Ben correctly states, was the year after our ban on commercial sale of assault weapons ends. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's directly connected. And of course, the violence has escalated ever since then. And the sale of those weapons those weapons bought here, smuggled there, are a major part of what allows them. They are about, that being a supply-driven war, the supply of guns being the main thing. In my time writing about fentanyl and now methamphetamine, I have come to believe that the same is true of this era of our drugs, which is to say that this is about supply creating demand. It's not about demanding fentanyl, demanding methamphetamine. I'll explain a little bit about how I see that. But the era of synthetic drugs is dramatic because it has done many things that have never happened before in fact, it changes almost everything we know about drugs, drug smuggling, profits, risk, treatment, addiction, overdose, on and on and on. We could go on and on about all the things it changes. Excuse me. All of this, though, makes sense from a trafficker's profit perspective. This is not about what users want. Whoops. Did I do that? No. Okay, good. I was pounding the table here. I thought maybe it reverberated and knocked that down. Okay, good. I'm glad I didn't have nothing to do with that. All right. So it's important to understand that opioids in particular, fentanyl is an opioid, meaning it attaches to the opioid receptors in each of our brains. Opioid is just like heroin. It's just far more easy for that molecule to hit our brain than for any plant-based opioid to do the same. Morphine, heroin, etc. Opioids have always been about supply creating demand, because opioids create an absolute dramatic change in our brain chemistry and our brain reward pathways. Very, very well demonstrated for years now that this is the case, and it creates almost a physical dependency in a way that other drugs simply really don't so much. And the truth is, all of this story really began with our own opioid epidemic, which was aggressive promotion of narcotic painkillers, prescription narcotic painkillers on the part of drug companies, particularly Purdue Pharma, owned by the now infamous Sackler family. They knew, and I read about this in the Least of Us. They knew that supply creates demand. That's why they offered OxyContin in 5 milligram doses, right? Because the doctors that they were trying to push to prescribe their pills would not prescribe a pill of 20 milligrams or 40 or 80 or certainly not 160. So how do they get them going? Well, look, doc, here's 5 milligrams. Just give it a shot. We'll see. We'll see if it works. They knew damn well that 5 milligrams was going to be 40 in a year. And then 120 after that, or 200 after that, that the dope did the job, the drug did the job for you. All you needed to do is push that doctor to provide the supply through prescription. And that is basically, and you can read this very, very brazenly, in my opinion, by reading the 277-page criminal complaint that the Massachusetts Attorney General put together against the Sackler family. You read, it all comes from internal memoranda. They knew exactly. That's why they gave discount coupons for the first month or so of use of OxyContin, right? That's why they gave away all these things like ice cream shops do. 5 uses, you get a 6th one free, that kind of crap, right? They knew that if you just provide a little bit, the drugs will, and you keep on pushing that doc to know when that doc might have second thoughts, boom, you're right there to tell them, no. Keep it going. This is the way it's supposed to work, And so what we did was the opioid epidemic created an enormous population of opioid addicted Americans, coast to coast, because all the doctors were coast to coast. It was not just regional. I mean, some regions were more afflicted than others, but but generally speaking, it's all over. In the same way, you have seen fentanyl, and I'll talk about meth in a little bit, as it said, but you have seen fentanyl produced in staggering quantities that parallels the way in which the opioid pills, the prescription narcotic painkillers, were reached every corner of the United States. Fentanyl, because it is produced in such ghastly quantities now, and because it is creating demand in ways I'll talk about in a minute, because it is creating demand, you are finding it have almost the same effect as all those pills did all across the country. So there's really no place in the country anymore where there is not fentanyl. I was on the texting yesterday with a guy from Maine. This guy says, all my friends are dying. They've died, or they're already dead, all from fentanyl. These were veteran heroin users who lived on heroin for a while, but now they're dying because of fentanyl. Enormous supplies, unmolested by the intrusion of law enforcement in Mexico, has meant huge numbers of people have become addicted to fentanyl, and huge numbers of people have therefore died, because it is the most potent of all the so far of the opioids we know of. Of course, there's various kinds of fentanyl, and some are much more potent than even regular fentanyl. It's the ability to produce in this staggering supplies that is what is changing the drug markets that we have seen, the changes we have seen in our drug markets in the last 6 to 8 years. You can make fentanyl very easily from a few little chemicals, and it's not difficult for somebody in the backyard with a kind of a barbecue kind of machine, apparatus to do so. What you end up doing then is you create this vast supply that then is begging for new ways of delivery. And so you have found all across the country now the counterfeit pills, right? Mexican traffickers have figured out how to make counterfeit pills very easily with these pill presses that are bought on the internet so easily. Percocet, things that pills that look like a Percocet or a Xanax bar, even a Tylenol. Mostly though, it's a generic oxycodone, a royal blue generic oxycodone 30 milligram pill that they've copied. All of those pills contain nothing but fentanyl. When I wrote The Least of Us, I interviewed the woman who was the first person arrested in the San Diego sector for smuggling pills from Tijuana to San Diego. The American woman addicted to heroin who moved to Tijuana because she wanted to be closer to her dope supply. They recruited her. She was smuggling 1,000 pills at a time into this kind of spandex pantsuit that she had. Now you're getting seizures of 200, 300,000 pills a day at one port of entry, Nogales port of entry, which is where I'm getting some of my information on this. It's just remarkable transformation, creating this brand new market up here. Fentanyl, because it is so cheap, because it is so prevalent, is now being mixed into cocaine, meth, marijuana, and of course now these pills. So what ends up happening is a couple of things. Either you know, almost everything contains fentanyl now. So you use, let's say, a line of cocaine with fentanyl. Very often people die right off the bat. That's what's happening a lot. And you read about this stuff. You know, there was a famous party of comics in Venice and LA where 4 people ingested cocaine. 3 of them died. 1 was revived miraculously at the ER. Michael K. Williams, great actor in The Wire, struggled with cocaine for years and got a hold of a batch of cocaine that had some fentanyl in it, and he died straight away. This is one option, one possibility. The other, though, is that you survive your first exposure to fentanyl now. And from that, you become very, very quickly addicted. And because the supply is so vast, it takes your tolerance up very, very high, much higher. That heroin doesn't exist in the streets of the United States so much anymore because it won't do any good. It will not keep the withdrawal symptoms away for those people who are now addicted to fentanyl. What's happening is that your tolerance, it just rises according to whatever the supply is in your area. So in Tucson, people are smoking 50 to 60 of those pills a day, the little Xanax or whatever they happen to be. You go up to Denver, folks in Denver say, well, the people here are smoking 25 to 40 pills a day. It's a little bit farther removed from the supply, but wherever the supply is, that's going to kind of determine your demand. Billings, Montana, it's 15 pills a day. But whatever the case is, it never stops until you die. And so that's what's really happening on the streets of the United States now. People are using and using and using, thinking that they can kind of use for quite a long time. The problem is now with fentanyl, there is no such thing as a long-term fentanyl use. There was with heroin. I've interviewed people on the streets of the United States who have used heroin 30 years. They didn't die. They have no kind of good life, but they're not dead. But now you get these the situations where people are using and using and using, and people don't last on the street more than 3 years. It's a rarity. And certainly I'm expecting nobody will ever last 10 years. You either get off the street and get treatment and get sober, or eventually you die. My feeling is that the people who were using heroin, into which fentanyl was first mixed, say in 2016, 17, 18, those years, 14, 15, right in there too. All those people, if they didn't get sober, they're dead. There's so many of those folks who didn't make it. I mean, you can tell because we are now seeing hundreds of thousands, 100,000 people plus die every year. And my feeling is very, very honestly, I swear, I don't get it. They say 80% of the people dying are dying from fentanyl. And my feeling is, what about the other 20%? What are they dying of? They're not dying from methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, you don't overdose from. Cocaine, you don't overdose from. But anyway, that's a whole other a question. So what fentanyl has done is this very, very ominous, because of the vast supplies creating demand, it's this weird churn system where people who are using fentanyl die. At the same time, people who are exposed to fentanyl are becoming new addicts. So there's people who are kind of like being exterminated. You extinguish the demand as you create the demand. And that is the result, in my opinion, of just vast quantities. It did not happen with that first fentanyl outbreak in 2006. Bunch of people died. It's unclear to me how many people actually got addicted to fentanyl. Most people would die because they are just simply not, they're using heroin. They're not used to fentanyl like this. And so you just kind of exterminate a significant market. What they didn't have opportunity to do in that case was to continue providing the supply to create more addicts, who then would not live long either by heroin standards. They live a couple of years. So you're seeing this just catastrophic quantities flow in, creating that kind of churn, right? People are dying as new people are being addicted, and those people die eventually. And then, and it's one of the reasons why traffickers don't seem all that perturbed when their clients die. Because they know, first of all, they're most likely addicted themselves, and they don't really, what happens to other people doesn't matter. They are interested in making their money and getting their dope. But also, it's like, well, there'll be new clients. There are always new clients. There's going to be more. So let's not worry about it. So now you've got all this innovation with these pills. You know, the state of Arizona, they seized last year alone. They seized 100. DEA and CBP down in Nogales seized, by my estimates, something close to 100 million of those pills last year. Just staggering quantity. So it's about this story is about them creating demand and then also perpetuating demand, because what you are finding is that as people get addicted to this stuff, they are become extraordinarily reluctant to accept treatment. You just do not find. In LA, they have a program now. It's called Reaching the 95. Reaching the 95 because 95% of the people that they reach out to on the streets say they don't need any treatment. They're fine. Most of those folks are addicted to meth, fentanyl, or both. They prefer it. So you're fine. You're living on the street, feces, beatings, exploitation, pimping. You're, you're daily taking risks with your life, and you think that this is you're fine. No, of course not. This is the drugs talking. It is a transformation of the basic brain chemistry that happens, especially with opioids, and especially with those drugs, those opioids that are very, very prevalent in supply and also in cheap. Pardon me. It's also important to understand some things about fentanyl, just so you know. Fentanyl is one of the great drugs ever invented. I've had fentanyl. Maybe some of you have had fentanyl in operations. Fentanyl in the operating room is magnificent. It's been a workhorse drug. It's transformed surgery, revolutionized surgery in America, well, across the world since 1960 when it was released to the market. One of the reasons it is so great is because it has a really very quick in and out. It takes you in of anesthesia. It's a fantastic anesthetic. It takes you in of anesthesia and then out very quickly. Unlike morphine, which takes you into anesthesia and then 4 or 5 hours later, you kind of gradually come out of the fog. Fentanyl is like boom, boom, boom. That's why so many anesthesiologists use it. So many paramedics use it. It's been a workhorse drug. I had a heart attack 2017. They gave me fentanyl. I watched myself be operated on because of fentanyl. Right? They put a stent here in my crotch, put it all the way up here, put a stent through my, and I was like half doped up, and then I come out of it and I watch on the video, no, there's that little thing going through my body again, and I'd be bam like that again. You know, it was, and then within as fentanyl was the operation was ending, I was lucid like I am right now. Okay. So fentanyl is this magnificent drug, but the thing about it, and this is what's understood, I think, by many people on the street, is that it's that quick in, quick out makes it an absolute torment for users because you are always having to use. That's why they use 50 or 60 of those pills a day, because you are always having to use fentanyl to keep the withdrawals away 4, 5, 6, 8 times, whatever it is. Heroin, it's twice a day, maybe 3 times. You got a lot of money, and one day you get three times. Fentanyl, you have to use all day long, and each time is a crapshoot. It's a Russian roulette, right? But it's because, and of course, that is what makes it a magnificent drug. If you're a dealer or a trafficker, because you now have a patient, a customer who's using 8 times a day where you used to use only twice. Or, you know, with cocaine, you give people fentanyl, put fentanyl in your cocaine. That person who used to use once a week or maybe on weekends becomes a fentanyl addict very quickly. That's why they put it in fentanyl, in cocaine, and in methamphetamine and other places, because they realize it's a customer expansion tool. Even as it kills people, it creates a new customer who now is going to buy from you 4 times a day or 8 times, whatever it is. You're never far away from the pills, from the dope. It's a transformative kind of drug because of all of this, and the fact that it's simply being created in such staggering quantities. So you have AMLO in Mexico, president of Mexico, who I once thought was a lucid political figure when I lived down there. I covered him. He was mayor Mexico City, the senator for that from Tabasco. I thought my girlfriend at the time was in his party. I thought, okay, this, you know, a lucid guy, a voice from the left. Obviously, if you watch his press conferences, that lucid is not an adjective you would use to describe the current president of Mexico. He denies there's a problem, but that's because they don't do toxicology tests. Right? When a person dies in the United States, you get your blood tested for whatever's in it, alcohol, nicotine, whatever. A great story in the LA Times last year about the medical examiner in Mexicali, who decided, he said, I'm going to test every body corpse that shows up now. I'm going to test the blood. They found 23% of the corpses tested positive for fentanyl. That's one city, a large one, million population, I think, is what Mexicali has. You've got a population like that. 23% of the corpses are testing positive for fentanyl. Tijuana's got to be more than that. Culiacan, who knows? I mean, but this is another example of supply creating demand. You start making it, and soon a place where that has no demand for fentanyl or really any opioid of any kind, all of a sudden has 23% of its corpses showing up with fentanyl in it. Supply creates demand. And I believe this now after 2 books on this topic. I used to believe when I lived in Mexico, I believed what Mexican government officials said, oh, this is all about the United States demand. No, I don't believe that at all anymore. I think my entire thinking has changed on this because of what I've watched in the last 2 books that I've written. But there's another story to this. We talk so much about fentanyl. It's very important because it's killing so many people, 100,000, going to be 112, 113,000 when we finally count all the people from 2023, which we haven't done yet, but we will. But what really taught the Mexican trafficking world about synthetic drugs and the benefits of synthetic drugs was not fentanyl, it was methamphetamine. So methamphetamine, they began to make early on with, as I said, ephedrine, the chemical used in Sudafed and all the decongestant. They diverted that. They got hold of that from the Mexican pharmaceutical industry, and they used part of that, and they industrialized the process of making methamphetamine. They learned how to do it. They were very expert at doing this. This towns of Apatzingán in Michoacán, and of course Guadalajara and nearby in the state of Jalisco, and that's where you see it's through learning how to make methamphetamine that the latest cartel, CG&G, grew up. But that's what taught them about the benefits of making your drugs rather than growing them, was methamphetamine. They industrialized this drug, and they did a very expert, professional, I guess you would say, job of doing it. The thing was that they never made enough to cover more than about half parts of the Western United States. And even that, when it came north, it was always cut. It was like 50% meth, 50% adulterant of some kind or another cheapo chemicals just to fill it out. The meth that they made was an exuberant social party drug. You want to be around people, you're everybody's best friend, you're jabbering away for 3 days. Then you crash, and then you wake up 2 days later, and if you still have a job, you go back to your job and that kind of thing, right? Well, and it was also, it was not enough to cover the rest of the country. So what you began to see as knowledge spread is the classic meth cook. Meth cooks making small amounts, grams, maybe an ounce, rarely more than an ounce, and making it in very convoluted. That's why you have to sign your life away when you're getting Sudafed pills at Costco and whatnot, wherever, right? Because they would take huge numbers of pills, try to distill the ephedrine down to make 3 grams or an ounce of methamphetamine. And that's the way things were for a lot. So in Oklahoma, Ohio, Nebraska, wherever, Montana, it was just all pure meth cooks making that stuff and in small amounts. And it kind of was limited because the supply was limited. The demand was, it was not as spread. But then in 2008, that entire story changed, and the Mexican government put a real restriction on the amount of ephedrine they would allow to be imported. The Mexican trafficking world figured out, was clearly concerned. That's why they hired Ricardo Valdez Torres to make ephedrine initially. Instead, he made fentanyl, but he was supposed to make ephedrine. Why? Because they could see eventually the government's going to just crack down on our golden goose here. So what they did was they search around, and I'm sure through the online and chemistry professors and whatnot, they figure out there's another way of making methamphetamine. It does not use ephedrine. It uses another chemical known as P2P, phenyl 2-propanone, legal chemical. And it's very messy to make methamphetamine that way. It stinks. It's more difficult, takes some real knowledge, but it has one benefit that all the other, that ephedrine does not have. And that is that you can make P2P with many, many different combinations of chemicals. I was in a DEA chemist's office in DC. Here, actually, where are we? We're in DC, aren't we? Yeah. And he had a big thing on his wall with all these different ways of making P2P. And he was constantly putting up new ones and posted. I think he had 10 or 12 Post-it notes, probably 15 or 20 on the map. And all of these ways use chemicals that are legal, cheap, industrial. A lot of them are toxic, but they are not difficult to find. And the government therefore cannot crack down on this essential chemical, because if they do, you make P2P this way, they crack down on these chemicals, you go to another way and go to another way. And so what ends up happening, if you have control of the ports, which they do, Manzanillo in Colima, Lázaro Cárdenas in Michoacán, Mexico City Airport, others I'm sure, but those two are really big in this story because they're so near Sinaloa, they're so near Guadalajara and all that, and Michoacán, that you can get these chemicals in quantities that are just staggering, which means that you can make your methamphetamine all year round. There's no seasons anymore with chemical-based drugs, right? No plants involved here. So you can make these drugs all year round in quantities that you simply have not ever seen. The interesting thing, the Breaking Bad series, right? Remember that series? Great show, fascinating show. Aired in 2008. I think it was very interesting that show began to air the very year that changes were afoot that would put an end to the meth cook in America. There are no more meth cooks in America. They're all gone. They've been outcompeted by these vast supplies that are P2P meth that are coming in now, have been coming in since about 2008 is when they put the restriction in. 2009 was still kind of a year of learning curve, but by 2010-11, you could see that they were really amping up production. More and more people were learning how to make it. More and more, again, it was like this vast kind of ecosystem of people. Some people knowing how to make it, some people knowing how to, and then of course the plaza system of the cartels works exactly to expand production, because what the plaza system is, the plaza boss doesn't care what you sell your meth for. He just wants you to pay him to produce it. So he wants people to produce it in his area. And when they do that, he wants them to buy the chemicals from him. So there's these two incentives to push vast quantities. We call them cartels. Economically, it's a good shorthand, but economically, according to the economic definition, an economic definition of a cartel is producers coming together to reduce supply to force price up. But fentanyl is an example of that, but the better example is methamphetamine, because we have pricing history for methamphetamine going back a lot of years in many regions. Nashville, where I live now, was $16,000 a pound. Now I think it's down to about $1,600, $1,200. I spoke with a DEA supervisor for Arizona. She said, I used to make undercover buys for $8,000 a pound in Phoenix. Now it's $700 a pound. You can see it's like 90%. While they're covering the country, literally covering the country, the prices also dropped by 90%. It's an amazing idea. Just an amazing, nobody has done that. It's just remarkable, the quantities, but I think promoted by the fact that they have absolute unlimited access to precursors coming in from mostly, I'm going to say, China, although other chemicals may come from, Chile, different places. It's just the world chemical market. And that, was going to be the main story I was going to tell. I did tell it. It's a huge story in my opinion. But along the way, I began to understand that there was another story connected to methamphetamine. And that is, methamphetamine is being made down in Mexico in quantities that are record potent. It's like 97, 98, 99% meth. It's not 50% like the ephedrine stuff. Because they're able to make so much of it, there is no reason to cut it. What's more, there's no reason for dealers on the street here to cut it. Because why? You cut your dope because you want it to extend, you want it to last, right? Because you can't find it but in West Virginia, I quote a guy in the book, he says, in West Virginia, he could find any day of the week. I used to sell grams, he told me. Now I could find any day of the week, I could find people who would sell me 10 pounds of methamphetamine 5 guys within a 10-mile radius. That's the kind of supply we're talking about, and it's nationwide. But the other part of the story is, as this potent meth began to spread, the other thing that began to happen is people began to drop very quickly into rapid onset symptoms of schizophrenia. And on the streets of America today, I believe that methamphetamine, especially fentanyl too, it's all part of the same kind of story, is a major driver behind our homelessness and our mental illness that we are seeing coast to coast. It's not the only reason people are homeless. Homelessness is a very, very complicated thing. Age out of foster care, you could become homeless very easily. Domestic violence, right? Everybody can be, it's very easy to be homeless. Out with release from prison without family support, you know, there's a high, you get an increase in your rent, you have a surgery, you can't afford rent and the surgery, whatever. There's a million different ways, but a big one is drug addiction, and these two drugs are a major part of it. But that's not it. It's the other part of the story is because they're so prevalent, because they're everywhere, they're also keeping people homeless. Regardless of why you were originally homeless, could be you aged out of foster care. Now you're 22, 24, whatever, and you don't have anybody. You know, now you have this very, very severe problem of using meth, using fentanyl. There's so much in those tent encampments and whatnot. It's just a brutal torment that people are afflicted. So now what you find is all across the country, frankly, and I know this because I've been all across the country speaking about this book and talking to people at conferences of drug counselors and paramedics and on and on, and ER docs and nurses and all that stuff. And I have never heard anybody say, no, that's not happening here. We absolutely are seeing people drop off into crazy. It's not what we call mental illness in college and high school, which is depression and anxiety. This is serious schizophrenia. You're seeing cheetahs come out of the walls. You're talking to voices that no one else can hear. You're seeing, mics, the government spying on you, implanting things in your this kind of crazy stuff that is leading people to be, you cannot live with someone who is up at 3 a.m. screaming about the government and taking apart the TV. And that's what's going on with this methamphetamine. I believe when I wrote the book, I thought it was because my hunch was no one was talking about this. No one was writing about this. I said, why is it happening? Well, maybe it's the toxic chemicals they use. My feeling now is that maybe that's part of it, but I think it's more likely now that the methamphetamine is coming in so potent and it's not being cut. And so we're getting an experiment, an unofficial experiment of what happens when you provide almost pure methamphetamine to an entire population, and how quickly will that lead to serious mental illness. And all across the country, some group of mayors just a few months ago testified before Congress. What's the biggest problem facing these mayors? Mental illness. When did that happen? Why did that happen? They didn't really explain it, but my feeling is very strongly now that this is a major driver. Is it the only driver? No. The street is its own producer of mental illness. But what's happening now is that we have this unbelievable quantities of these drugs coming north, creating people who are incapable now of opting out of the street life. Same is true of methamphetamine, is true of fentanyl. Would you like to? We got beds here. We got a opportunity for you to do this. No. I'm fine. It's a scary world out there because, and at the same time, I will say this. As that was happening, we began to apply policies that were devised for another time. I believe decriminalization of these drugs has been a huge disaster, particularly for the people it was designed to help. Those people now need to be off the street. They're not going to live. They're creating public health and public safety problems for themselves and the community, but most of all, they are going to die. And yet we have policies, particularly on the West Coast, I would say, I'm not sure about DC. I know New York a little bit. Well, we don't prosecute people for selling fentanyl. Selling fentanyl is like shooting a gun into a crowd. It's been proven. You are going to kill somebody. You're going to hurt somebody, and most likely you'll kill somebody. You know, if you just say, okay, you can sell this stuff, fine, no problem. That's what's been going on in San Francisco and Seattle and Sacramento and Vegas and on and on and on and on. So at the same time, the drugs are changing, our attitudes are being imported from another era in which these policies are simply not appropriate. And so you're finding people just simply, I believe it's called compassion. People go out and, hey, well, do you want treatment? No. Yeah, fine. Okay, I'll end it right now in just a minute. I'll end it right here. And they'll say, no, no, well, they'll say, well, the person's not ready for treatment. Here's the fact on the street of America today. You will never be ready for treatment in the very short window it takes for meth to drive you mad and fentanyl to kill you. That is what vast supplies of meth and fentanyl are creating on our streets today. Far from what Mr. Lopez Obrador would say, this is a binational problem. It requires aggressive binational response. And it requires a recognition of the problems that we both contribute, our guns and their complete inability or unwillingness to deal with the precursor chemicals that are coming in from the rest of the country. There's a lot more to say, but as John said, it's getting late, everyone's tired, and I'll just end it there.
I'm not so much going to say everybody, but amazing. You've got us think. Thank you so much. I am going to say that because of time restrictions on venue, etc., I'm just going to leave everybody to let that rattle. Informal conversations. We need to go to reception. We need to go to book sale. Raise questions, go back and forth. And I think we're all going to be thinking about all of this for a long time. And actually, I have one more thing. I found this the most amazing, engaging. I kind of understand why on this beautiful day, a larger portion of the Georgetown community may not have been here. Tell your friends, family. It's available on the Georgetown Americas Institute YouTube channel. Watch it, see it, engage it. Think about it, worry about it. Thank you all.